Good afternoon, everyone. Hope all of you are doing good. So before we start, am I audible? Is everyone able to listen to me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so today we are going to start with chapter 4, which is share capital and debentures. Now, talking of what are the things we are going to cover in this chapter, इस chapter में हम सब लोग क्या क्या सीखने वाले हैं. So अभी हम जब start करेंगे, I'll just give you a brief overview of the entire chapter that क्या कौन से sections हम cover करने वाले हैं, कौन से topics हम देखने वाले हैं इस chapter में, and after that we'll start with the chapter. And also let's make it a very interactive session. If I'm asking a question, आपको क्या करना है, आपको उसका आंसर देना है. Either you can drop in a message in the chat box, or you can also unmute yourself and give the answer. Am I audible? There's someone who says I'm not audible. So I would just request all of you to just drop in a message in the chat box if you are facing any problem. So I guess I'm audible. Okay. Okay, so let's start. So the topic which we are going to cover, or which we are going to start, is share capital and debentures. So जब भी कोई टॉपिक पहले स्टार्ट करते हैं, सबसे पहले ये जानना बहुत जरूरी होता है दैट व्हाट आर द थिंग्स वी आर गोइंग टू लर्न इन दिस टॉपिक. तो अगर आपको यही नहीं पता होगा कि आप क्या क्या सीखने वाले हो इस टॉपिक में, तो फिर देयर विल बी नो बेस फॉर यू टू स्टार्ट विद दिस टॉपिक. सो इन दिस टॉपिक शेयर कैपिटल एंड डिबेंचर, सबसे पहले तो आप जिस भी चीज के बारे में पढ़ रहे हो, आपको पता होना चाहिए उसका मीनिंग क्या है. सो विल फर्स्ट स्टार्ट विथ मीनिंग एंड डेफिनेशन. उसके बाद we'll start with section 43. So section 42 तक prospectus and allotment में covered है. Share capital, the topic of share capital, the provisions in relation to share capital, they start with section 43. So we'll first understand the meaning. We'll also understand the classification of capital of the company, and post which we'll start with section 43. सेक्शन 44 एंड 45 बहुत ही छोटे छोटे सेक्शंस है, और अभी आपके सिलेबस में है भी नहीं, बट आई विल जस्ट वॉक यू थ्रू दोस टू सेक्शंस की वो दो सेक्शन क्या बोलते हैं. So we'll start with section 43, then we'll go to section 44, 45, understand it in brief. उसके बाद में we'll go to section 46, which talks about share certificate. उसके बाद section 47, which talks about voting rights. So as you all know, जब भी हम शेयर कैपिटल की बात कर रहे हैं, इक्विटी शेयर्स की बात कर रहे हैं, प्रेफरेंस शेयर्स की बात कर रहे हैं, सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट एलिमेंट जो आ जाता है वो ये होता है कि किसके पास वोटिंग राइट है, कितना वोटिंग राइट है, हाउ आर वी गोइंग टू कैलकुलेट द वोटिंग राइट. सो सेक्शन 47 में हम वो समझेंगे कि वोटिंग राइट्स कैसे हम आइडेंटिफाई करेंगे, और कौन से सिचुएशन में किस शेयर होल्डर के पास वोटिंग राइट रहेगा. इन विच सिचुएशन डज द इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स हैव वोटिंग राइट, इन विच सिचुएशन does the preference shareholders have voting rights. So we'll understand all the cases there. ये लॉ की क्लास हो रही है. So voting rights identify करेंगे, then we'll go to section 48, which talks about variation in voting rights. वेरिएशन कैसे कैसे सिचुएशन में होता है, और वेरिएशन करने के लिए किसका कंसेंट लगेगा, क्या लगेगा, विल टॉक अबाउट दैट इन सेक्शन 48. उसके बाद में विल टॉक ऑफ 3 स्मॉल सेक्शंस, 50 एंड 51, which 49 50 जो है ये कॉल्स की बात करते हैं, शेयर्स पे जो कॉल्स होते हैं इन ऑर्डर टू कॉल इन द मनी which is payable on shares from the shareholders. So section 49 और 50 में हम वो देखेंगे. Section 51 talks of पेमेंट ऑफ डिविडेंड, इट इज रिलेटेड टू डिविडेंड, सो सेक्शन 51 में वो बात करेंगे, और प्रपोर्शन ऑफ डिविडेंड टू बी वेरी प्रिसाइज। और फिर उसके बाद we'll understand what are the different ways in which shares are issued by a company. Say for example, shares are issued at premium, shares are issued at discount, या what are the prohibitions on a company to issue shares at discount. तो ये सारी चीजें we'll understand under section 52 and section 53 की। issue of shares at premium, ये सब आपने accounts में पढ़ा होगा, issue of shares at premium, issue of shares at discount, पढ़ा है या नहीं पढ़ा है? Might have come across these terms, issue of shares at premium, issue of shares at discount, in accountancy. Foundation में भी पढ़ा होगा। Yes. Okay. So post which we'll understand what sweat equity shares are. There's something called as sweat equity shares. So उसके बाद हम देखेंगे sweat equity shares क्या होते हैं। उसके बाद we'll understand what redeemable preference shares are. And post which we are also going to cover the different types of issue which are made, bonus issue, rights issue, बोनस शेयर्स इशू करते वक्त क्या क्या प्रोविजंस कंप्लाई करने चाहिए, राइट्स इशू करते वक्त कौन से प्रोविजंस कंपनी को कंप्लाई करने होंगे। So ये सारे sections we'll understand, and one very important point which we are going to see under this chapter is alteration of share capital. So जब हम मेमोरेंडम के क्लॉजेस के ऑल्टरेशन की बात करते हैं, in chapter 2 when we were discussing about alteration of clauses of memorandum, I told you that we'll discuss about alteration of share capital later. हाँ, सारे sections याद नहीं रहते, that is completely fine. I'm just giving you an overview कि हम क्या क्या cover करने वाले हैं. So it is okay if you do not remember the section numbers, it is completely okay, but you should definitely remember the provisions. Provisions याद नहीं रहेंगे तो फिर क्या लिख के आओगे एग्जाम में। So alteration of share capital की बात करेंगे, which is one very important topic which we are going to cover in this chapter. We'll talk of rights issue, bonus issue, and another very important topic which is buyback. Buyback की बात करेंगे। और फिर उसके बाद आफ्टर दैट सेक्शन 71 और 72 जो है, ये दो सेक्शंस डिबेंचर्स से डील करते हैं। सो एंटायरली द टोटल नंबर ऑफ सेक्शंस व्हिच वी आर गोइंग टू कवर इन दिस चैप्टर स्टार्टिंग फ्रॉम सेक्शन 43 अप टू सेक्शन 72, ये जो है हम इस chapter 4 में कवर करने वाले। and it is completely all right if you do not remember the section number, it is completely okay. What is important is understanding the concept and understanding the provision. So अगर provision समझ में आ गया है और आप provision को अच्छे से लिख पा रहे हो, it is completely fine. You do not have to memorize the section number, sit and memorize the section number. Section numbers over a period of time आपको अपने आप याद हो जाएंगे. So do not only concentrate on memorizing the section numbers. Okay. So are you all clear with the overview of the chapter? Any questions here? ये तो overview ही था. So any questions or any confusions? किसी को कुछ क्वेश्चन है या कोई कंफ्यूजन है? Okay, so let's start. So सबसे पहले I told you that we will cover the meaning or the definition of shares. So this term share, it is defined in section 2 clause 84 of the Companies Act 2013. So 2 clause 84 जो है वो share को define करता है, और 2 clause 84 जो है वो क्या बोलता है share के बारे में, वो share को कैसे define करता है। तो 2 clause 84 जो है वो ये बोलता है that share means a share in the capital of the company. Look at how the definition has been given. Definition में आपको बस इतना बोला है, share means a share in the capital of the company. So if we understand this in layman's term या फिर if we try and understand this in simple language, तो क्या होता है, say ये पूरा capital है कंपनी का, और ये जो कैपिटल है कंपनी का, इट इज डिवाइडेड इनटू स्मॉल स्मॉल यूनिट्स. दिस कैपिटल ऑफ द कंपनी इज डिवाइडेड इनटू स्मॉल यूनिट एंड ईच यूनिट हियर इज कॉल्ड अ शेयर. ये जो स्मॉल यूनिट्स है उनको हम शेयर बोलते हैं. So the capital of the company is divided into small units, small parts, and those units are called as share of the company. However, when defined, जो law का language है वो ये बोलता है that share means a share in the capital of the company and it includes stock. So share, this is for both November, people appearing in November 22 and May 23. So you need not worry. This is completely updated, and this is a Hindi plus English batch, so cannot be completely in English. I'm so sorry for that. So share means a share in the capital of the company and it includes stock. Now, I have a question for all of you, and I know that you all have understood the meaning of share even at your foundation level. So, मेरा question ये है that what do you understand by this term stock? This term stock is definitely not stock in trade. Stock in trade की बात नहीं हो रही है यहाँ पे. So, what does this term stock stand for, which is included in the definition of share? So, share in the capital and it includes stock. So what does stock stand for here? Bundle of shares. Okay, correct. And is it a bundle of fully paid up shares or partly paid up shares? Now, since you are giving so many answers, तो मुझे लगा मैं एक और question पूछ लेती हूँ. It is not a stock of partly paid up shares. It is a stock of fully paid up shares. So when we say that share includes stock, now in simple terms, as you all have clearly mentioned, stock is nothing but a bundle of shares, and it is a bundle of fully paid up shares. अभी bundle of shares का मतलब क्या होता है? Bundle basically means collection या फिर a group of shares. So a group of fully paid up shares is called as a stock. So क्या हो रहा है? एक share, say one company has issued so many shares. Say you are a shareholder in a company and you own 10 shares in that company, and all these shares are fully paid. ठीक है, अभी ये 10 shares आप इंडिविजुअली होल्ड करते हो, इंडिविजुअली आप 10 shares होल्ड कर रहे हो एक कंपनी के. अभी क्या करते हैं, ये 10 shares को एक लॉट बना देते हैं या फिर बंडल अप कर लेते हैं. वी ग्रुप दीज 10 shares. So that will now be termed as stock. So shares can be converted into stock. Stock issue नहीं होता है. Always remember it is a share which is issued. And fully paid up shares, a collection or a bundle of fully paid up shares will be stock. And shares can be converted into stock, and that stock can also be reconverted into fully paid up shares. तो शेयर को स्टॉक में कन्वर्ट किया जा सकता है और स्टॉक को भी शेयर्स में कन्वर्ट किया जा सकता है. इन डिटेल हम कन्वर्जन ऑफ शेयर्स इनटू स्टॉक के बारे में पढ़ेंगे व्हेन वी गो टू सेक्शन 61. सेक्शन 61 में जब जाएंगे तब वहां पे वी विल डिस्कस इन डिटेल हाउ कन्वर्जन ऑफ शेयर्स इनटू स्टॉक हैपन एंड हाउ रिकन्वर्जन इज possible. So in simple terms, if I state what stock is, so stock is nothing but a bundle of shares or a collection of fully paid up shares. So stock is a collection of fully paid up shares or a group or a bundle of fully paid up shares. इतना समझ में आया? Are you all clear up to now? Any question? Have you all understood what stock is? Okay, so we've now understood the meaning of share. So what is share in simple terms? Share in simple terms is a small part or a small unit in the capital of the company. The share is nothing but a small unit in the capital of the company and it includes stock. Stock is a collection or a bundle of fully paid up shares. So with this, we've now understood the meaning of the term share. Abhi, now let's understand about classification of share capital of the company. Abhi, now you tell me, why do you think share capital is important for a company? Share capital की जरूरत क्या है एक company को? Why do you think share capital is important for a company? Raise fund, okay. Anything else? See, you are starting a business. Will you not require capital to run your business? You will, right? So similarly, when a company is setting itself up, the company will also require capital to carry on its activities and also to run its business. So उसके लिए कंपनी को कैपिटल लगेगा. बेसिकली कंपनी को लगेंगे फंड्स. नाउ व्हेन वी टॉक ऑफ फंड्स रेज्ड बाय कंपनी कैन बी ऑफ टू टाइप्स. दो कैटेगरी के फंड्स हो सकते हैं. एक तो हो सकता है कंपनी पब्लिक के पास जा रही है, पब्लिक से पैसा ले रही है, पब्लिक को अपने शेयर्स अलॉट कर रही है, जो बनेगा पार्ट कंपनी के कैपिटल का. एंड ये जो शेयर होल्डर्स होंगे वो दे विल बिकम द ओनर्स ऑफ द कंपनी. सो जब कंपनी पब्लिक से पैसा रेज कर रही है वो पार्ट हो जाएगा कंपनी के कैपिटल का. बट द अदर वे इन विच द कंपनी कैन रेज फंड्स इज वाया बोरोइंग. कंपनी कैन ऑल्सो बोरो मनी. कंपनी लोन ले सकती है, कंपनी उधार ले सकती है किसी से. सो विच विल बी इन द फॉर्म ऑफ डेट. So when we talk of share capital, we are basically talking of the capital of the company. However, जब हम debentures की बात कर रहे हैं, debentures के केस में borrowing हो रहा है. Debentures के केस में the company is not raising capital. So जब हम shares की बात कर रहे हैं या share capital की बात कर रहे हैं, वहां पे जो shareholders होते हैं company के, they have ownership interest in the company. You all must have heard that shareholders, they are the owners of the company. Why is that so? Because there is some element of risk involved when they are investing in the company, and that risk gives them an ownership interest in the company. However, when a company is issuing debentures, उस situation में जो debenture holder है company का, वो company का creditor होगा. The debenture holder would be the creditor of the company, and since he is the creditor of the company, उसका interest जो होगा company में, that will not be an owner's interest, rather that will be a lender's interest. So there are different ways in which a company can raise funds. It can either be by way of raising capital, or it can either be by way of borrowing money, borrowing funds from different people. So ये कुछ तरीके होते हैं of how the company is raising funds. Now talking of share capital, now since we are talking of share capital, we are talking of classification of share capital. जब हम share capital की बात करते हैं, I'm sure you all are aware of the classification of share capital, but let's just quickly brush up or revise what you have already studied about classification of share capital. So when we talk of classification of share capital, now memorandum of association में एक clause होता है, which is capital clause or capital clause. Now you tell me, what does the capital clause in the memorandum state? Capital clause में क्या लिखा होता है? What is stated in the capital clause of the memorandum of association? Authorized capital. Correct. So what is authorized share capital? The maximum amount which can be raised by the company. मतलब अगर कंपनी को इशू करना है, कंपनी को पैसा रेज करना है बाय वे ऑफ इशू ऑफ इट्स शेयर्स, ऑथराइज कैपिटल इज द मैक्सिमम अमाउंट जिसके ऊपर कंपनी पैसा रेज नहीं कर सकती. Now, can this authorized capital be increased? हाँ, there are provisions for alteration of authorized capital, alteration of capital clause. जब हम alteration पे जाएंगे तब ये वाली बात we'll discuss in detail. So authorized share capital is basically the maximum amount which can be raised by the company. Company कितना maximum amount raise कर सकती है by way of issue of its shares. अभी authorized share capital के बाद जो second classification आता है वो आता है issued capital. Now, what is issued capital? What is issued capital? Issued for subscription from public. Correct. So authorized share capital, say for example, the authorized share capital of the company is say rupees 10 lakhs. Now, do you think 10 lakhs एक साथ ही पूरा company raise करेगी? Definitely not. या तो एक साथ raise कर सकती है या फिर the company will raise this amount of 10 lakhs in small chunks. अभी out of say 10 lakhs, company has made an issue of rupees 5 lakh. Company is in need of 5 lakh rupees. So company has made an issue of 5 lakhs. So issued capital is that part of authorized share capital which is issued by the company for the purpose of subscription. अभी issued capital के बाद जो capital आता है वो होता है subscribed capital. Now, when we talk of subscribed capital is that part of issued capital which is subscribed by public. Now, the issue was made of 5 lakh. It is not necessary that पूरा का पूरा 5 lakh public subscribe कर लेगी. It is possible that the public would subscribe the entire amount, or it is possible that over subscription हो जाए. So whenever we are talking of subscription of capital of the company, क्या possibilities है इसमें? The possibilities are over subscription, full subscription और under subscription. Now what is over subscription? अभी 5 लाख का issue किया, 5 लाख में से 5 लाख से ज़्यादा का application मिला, say the company has received application for 6 lakh. So that is the case of oversubscription. Full subscription is 5 lakh issued and 5 lakh subscribed. So that is a case of full subscription. And under subscription is a situation wherein 5 lakh has been issued, but out of 5 lakhs, only 3 lakhs say has been subscribed. So that is called as under subscription. So subscribed capital क्या होगा? Subscribed capital is that part of issued capital which has been subscribed by the public. Say for example, यहाँ पे 4 lakh has been subscribed by the public. So 4 lakh will become our subscribed capital. अभी subscribe करने के बाद company call करेगी. So called up capital आएगा. Called up capital is basically that part of the capital जहाँ पे company ने calls किए हैं in order to receive money from the shareholders. And then finally comes the paid up share capital. Paid up capital is the amount which has been paid up on the shares of the company. So that will become the paid up capital of the company. So this is in short, in brief, the classification of share capital of the company. जब हम share capital की बात कर रहे हैं तो share capital को कैसे divide किया गया है in the company. So this was with respect to classification of share capital. And every capital comes from the previous one. Issued is the provision of minimum subscription of 90% is not being given in Companies Act. It has been prescribed under SEBI regulation. It is nowhere stated in the Companies Act. Companies Act only states under section 39 that the amount which is being stated in the prospectus as minimum subscription should be received by the company. However, 90% wala jo requirement, it has been stated only in SEBI. So this was with respect to classification of share capital. Is this clear? Let's now have a look at the text and move on and start with section 43. So जैसा हमने समझा, shares they represent ownership interest in the company, whereas debentures represent lenders' interest in the company. Now talking of meaning of share, so share is a share in the share capital of the company and it includes stock. So जैसा हमने समझा, it is the share capital is divided into small units. Each unit has its own distinct has its own face value. Say for example, अगर 10 lakhs का authorized share capital है, तो ऐसा हो सकता है this is divided into 1 lakh shares of rupees 10 each. Or it may be so possible that it is divided into 10 lakh shares of rupees 1 each. So face value और कितने shares में divide किया गया है capital, ये सारा कुछ stated होता है in the capital laws of the company. And the shares, they include stock. Stock is nothing but it is an aggregate of the fully paid up shares of the company. तो उसको हम stock बोलते हैं. However, stock is not something which is issued. It is only a bundling up of fully paid up shares of the company. Stock issue नहीं होता है. तो it is only shares of the company which are issued. Stock is not something which is issued. So now let's talk about the classification of shares. हमने अभी क्या समझा है? हमने समझा है what is a share, and we have understood about the classification of share capital of the company. Let's now understand about the classification of share or the types of shares which are issued by a company. Now there are two types of shares which I am sure आप सबको पता होगा जिसके बारे में, equity shares and preference shares. There is a further classification of equity shares as well, but we'll talk about the further classification later. It depends on the voting rights of the equity shareholders. However, basic classification जो है वो दो types में होता है, equity shares and preference shares. अभी जब हम बात करते हैं of preference shares, the name itself suggests कि preference shares जो है उनको कहीं पे कुछ preference मिल रहा है. They are being preferred, they are being given some kind of preference. So now you tell me what kind of preference do these preference shareholders they receive. क्या type का preference मिलता है preference shareholders को? Dividend, yes. What with respect to dividend? Repayment of capital during winding up, yes. Paid before equity shares, yes. So when we are talking of preference shares or when we are talking of preference shareholders, they get two types of preferences. The first preference is with respect to dividend, payment of dividend. They get a fixed percentage of dividend, they receive a fixed percentage of dividend from the company, and not only that, they are paid dividend in priority to the equity shareholders. जो पहले प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स को मिलेगा उसके बाद में इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स के पास जाएगा, कुछ भी जाएगा तो. So the first preference which the preference shareholders receive is with respect to the payment of dividend. It can either be a fixed amount or it can be a fixed rate at which the preference shareholders are being paid dividend. So पहला preference हो गया with respect to payment of dividend, and the second preference which the preference shareholders receive is in case of repayment. Repayment क्या? Repayment of the capital at the time in case of winding up of the company. तो जब capital pay होता है वापस से to the shareholders. Now shareholders since they are owners of the company, इनको तो सबसे last में मिलेगा. But क्योंकि preference shareholders equity shareholders से कम risk bear कर रहे हैं, they'll be given preference over the equity shareholders at the time of repayment, जब winding up हो रहा है company का. Winding up basically means जब company पूरी dissolve हो रही है, liquidate हो रही है, and all the assets of the company are sold in order to pay off the liability of the company. So there are two preferences which preference shareholders receive. One is with respect to payment of dividend. They are paid dividend at a fixed rate or at a fixed amount. And the second is at the time of winding of the company, they are repaid first. They are paid in priority to the equity shareholders. So they have this preferential rights in repayment and also at the time of payment of dividend. अभी equity shareholders की बात करेंगे तो equity shareholders को ऐसे fixed rate पे या fixed amount का dividend नहीं मिलता. So they are not entitled to any fixed rate of dividend or a fixed amount of dividend. However, whenever you would have made balance sheets, accounts में भी जब आप sum solve करते हो तो preference shares के पहले हमेशा लिखा होता है एक percentage, 10% preference shares, 9% preference shares और 5% preference shares, whatsoever it is. तो वो जो percentage लिखा होता है, that is the percentage of dividend which will be paid on those preference shares. So preference shareholders की जब हम बात करते हैं, they receive dividend at a fixed rate or at a fixed amount, and they are repaid before the equity shareholders at the time of winding up of the company. So this was the meaning of preference shares. However, when we talk of equity shares और जो equity share capital का definition है ना Companies Act में, वो बस इतना बोलता है that which is not preference share capital is equity share capital, which means क्या, जहां पे प्रेफरेंस नहीं है विद रेस्पेक्ट टू पेमेंट ऑफ डिविडेंड और जहां पे प्रेफरेंस नहीं है विद रेस्पेक्ट टू रीपेमेंट, उसको हम बोलेंगे इक्विटी शेयर कैपिटल. सो इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स, दे डू नॉट नो उनको कितना डिविडेंड मिलने वाला है भी या नहीं मिलने वाला है. एंड इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स, दे ऑल्सो डू नॉट नो कि वाइंडिंग अप के टाइम पे will they receive the payment, preference shareholders को payment मिलने के बाद, if at all there is some amount left after the payment is being made to the preference shareholders, the equity shareholders would receive the amount. एंड प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स में आपने ये भी सुना होगा क्यूमुलेटिव प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स होते हैं कि से इस साल डिविडेंड नहीं पे हुआ तो अगले साल जब डिविडेंड पे होगा, सो इस साल का भी और अगले साल का भी दोनों का डिविडेंड उनको मिलेगा इन द नेक्स्ट ईयर. So whenever a company is declaring dividend, dividend हमेशा पहले preference shareholders को मिलेगा, उसके बाद equity shareholders को मिलेगा. Preference shareholders, they are any which ways entitled to a fixed rate of dividend every year. However, if the company has not declared any dividend, तो equity shareholders को dividend नहीं मिलेगा, but preference shareholders को मिलेगा. और अगर उस साल company नहीं pay कर रही है dividend, तो उस साल का और there will be an accumulation of dividend in case of preference shares. However, that will not happen in case of equity shareholders. अगर say in year 1 equity shareholders are not paid any dividend, so in year 2 equity shareholders will not be paid dividend of year 1. However, when we talk of preference shareholders, so year 1 if they are not paid any dividend, in year 2 when the dividend is being paid, they'll be paid dividend of year 1 as well. So there is an accumulation of dividend which happens, and that is in case of cumulative preference shares. So that is one very significant difference when we are talking of equity shareholders and preference shareholders. However, जब हम equity shareholders की बात करते हैं, they have voting rights. Equity shareholders के पास क्या है? Voting rights है. मतलब they are the ones who can participate in the decision making process in the company. Voting rights means what? Now, whenever a company is making any decision, whenever a company is passing any resolution, so उसमें क्या होता है? The equity shareholders, the members of the company, they come attend the meeting and they give their vote, whether they are in favor of this change or whether they are against it. So equity shareholders, they can participate in this decision making process. However, preference shareholders के पास ये opportunity नहीं होता है. वो लोग meeting तो attend करेंगे, पर meeting attend करके वो वहां पे vote नहीं कर सकते. They cannot become a part in the decision making process. Exceptions are there जो हम लोग section 47 में पढ़ेंगे, so do not reach upon any conclusions. But primarily whenever we talk of voting rights किसके पास होते हैं? Voting rights, equity shareholders of the company, they have got voting rights. So section 43 क्या बोलता है? Section 43 basically talks of the kinds of share capital which a company has. So section 43 it states the share capital of the company limited by shares shall be of two kinds, namely equity share capital. Now there is a further classification of equity share capital जो हमने अभी नहीं समझा है, we'll talk of that later. And the second is preference share capital. So section 43 basically talks about the classification of share capital of a company limited by shares, and that is the reason why we were understanding कि equity share capital, equity shares के केस में क्या होता है और preference shares के केस में क्या होता है. Now most of you would be thinking कि ये सब basics है, we know all of this. I know you all must be knowing all of this. In fact, beyond this आप लोगों को इससे ज़्यादा भी पता होगा, but it is a part of your syllabus and that's the reason why we are covering all of it. Okay, so equity share capital क्या होता है, preference share capital क्या होता है? Like I've told you, equity share capital mean all the share capital which is not preference share capital. So in order to understand the meaning of equity share capital, you should first understand the meaning of preference share capital. अभी Companies Act में बहुत जगह ऐसा होता है कि एक definition, one definition is related to another definition. Say for example, definition of a public company. If you remember the definition of public company का definition यही बोलता है, these are not basics, these are a part of your syllabus. So that's the reason why I am going into a lot of detail. So public company का definition यही बोलता है that a company which is not a private company is a public company. So in order to know what a public company is, you should know what a private company is. So private company के restrictions आपको पता है तो आपको ये पता चल जाएगा कि public company क्या होगा. So similarly here, in order to know what equity share capital is, you should first know what preference share capital is. So preference share capital, they carry preferential right with respect to payment of dividend and repayment in case of winding up. So that was with respect to the classification of capital into equity and preference. Now let's talk about the further classification of equity share capital. Now, equity share capital is further divided into two types. There are two types of equity shares which are issued by a company. One is equity share capital with uniform voting rights. The other is equity share capital with differential voting rights. We also call them as DVRs. Okay, so when we talk of equity shares with uniform voting rights, हम क्या बोल रहे हैं या उसका मतलब क्या है? Normally क्या होता है? If you have one share, you have one vote. If you own one share in a company, you have one vote in that company. So your voting right is in proportion to the share capital or the paid up share capital which you hold in that company. So when we talk of equity shares with uniform voting rights, so unka jo voting right hai, it is proportionate to their holding in the company. It is proportionate to the number of shares which they hold in the company. That is normal voting rights. However, when we talk of equity shares with differential voting rights, यहाँ पे क्या है? यहाँ पे difference होगा in voting rights. यहाँ पे one share will not be equal to one vote. There will be a difference in voting rights. Now, to cite a few examples of companies which have actually issued equity shares with differential voting rights, it is Tata Motors, there's Future Retail. These are a few companies which have issued equity shares with differential voting rights. So DVRs में क्या होता है? Like I've told you, differential voting right. Name itself suggests कि voting right में कुछ तो difference है. There is a difference in the voting rights which the shareholders have in the situation. Now क्या difference की बात कर रहे हैं हम? Let's understand. अभी normally जैसे मैंने आपको बताया that one share is equal to one vote. But अगर DVR issue हो रहा है तो one share may not be equal to one vote. Will not be equal to one vote. Rather उससे कम होगा. There will be a difference in the voting right. नॉर्मल केस में 1 शेयर 1 वोट होता है, बट डीवीआरस के केस में 1 शेयर विल नॉट बी इक्वल टू 1 वोट, रादर कम वोट होगा आपका. नाउ व्हाट आर यू डूइंग? यू आर गिविंग अप अ पार्ट ऑफ योर वोटिंग राइट. विल यू गिव अप योर वोटिंग राइट? ऐसे ही आप दे दोगे आपका वोटिंग राइट? अगर कोई आपको आके बोले, आप कंपनी के शेयर होल्डर हो और आपको आके बोलता है कि योर 1 शेयर इज इक्वल टू 1 वोट, बट गिव अप योर वोट, और से आपका आज से आपका 1 शेयर इज इक्वल टू ओनली हाफ वोट, या फिर आपसे आज से आपका 1 शेयर इज इक्वल टू ओनली 1/10 वोट, विल यू अग्री टू इट विदाउट एनी कंडीशंस? अगर कोई आपको आके बोले कि आज से आपका 1 शेयर विल नॉट बी इक्वल टू 1 वोट, will you agree to it without any conditions, without asking the reason, without anything? Definitely not. You would want something in return. You would definitely say na ki theek hai, I am giving up my voting right, so I would want something in return for this. Consideration is required at every place. हर जगह consideration बहुत important होता है. So यहाँ पे you would say that okay fine, yeah, you would demand higher dividend या फिर any other preferences. So Tata Motors ने जब DVRs issue किए थे, at that time their 1 share had 1/10 voting right, and they gave 5% dividend at 5 percentage points more to equity shareholders with differential voting rights. The concept of DVR, it came in DVRs usually आप देखो तो was basically in order to ensure that company का जो voting power है वो सही हाथों में रहे, and also DVRs जब हम DVRs की बात करते हैं ना, DVRs are less priced than the normal equity shares. सो इन्वेस्टर्स इन्वेस्ट भी कर रहे हैं कंपनी में, उनको डिविडेंड भी ज्यादा मिल रहा है. हाउएवर जो डिसाइडिंग अथॉरिटी होता है, डिसाइडिंग अथॉरिटी इज स्टिल लाइंग विद द इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स जिनके पास यूनिफॉर्म वोटिंग राइट्स है. However, differential voting rights के shares जब भी कंपनी इशू कर रही होती है, whenever a company is issuing DVRs, it is basically raising money. पैसा तो raise हो ही रहा है, but however they are also not giving up the entire decision making power. जो डिसीजन मेकिंग अथॉरिटी होता है, पूरा डिसीजन मेकिंग अथॉरिटी नहीं जा रहा है, बिकॉज डीवीआर में से अभी इफ 1 शेयर इज इक्वल टू 1/10 वोट, तो यू शुड हैव 10 शेयर्स ऑफ द कंपनी एंड फिर तब आपका एक वोट गिना जाएगा. However, अगर आपके पास नॉर्मल वोटिंग राइट है तो आपका 1 शेयर विल बी इक्वल टू 1 वोट. सो उससे क्या हो रहा है, सिंस देयर इज अ डिफरेंस इन द वोटिंग राइट्स हियर, इफ the normal shareholders of the company, उनके पास जो डिसीजन मेकिंग अथॉरिटीज है, डिसीजन मेकिंग राइट्स है, वो डिवॉल्व नहीं होंगे, वो डाइल्यूट नहीं होंगे, एंड दैट्स द मेन रीजन व्हाई कंपनीज दे इशू डीवीआरस. आई होप दैट्स क्लियर नाउ. Now, अगर कंपनी को डीवीआर इशू करना है, if a company wants to issue DVR, company will have to comply with certain rules and regulations, certain provision, and that has been specified under Rule 4. Rule 4 specify करता है that what are the conditions which have to be complied with the company if a company wants to issue equity shares with differential voting rights. Now, what are they? सबसे पहले तो the articles of association of the company, they should authorize the company to issue equity shares with differential voting rights. मतलब क्या, आर्टिकल्स ऑफ एसोसिएशन ऑफ द कंपनी ने परमिट करना चाहिए कंपनी को, द आर्टिकल्स ऑफ एसोसिएशन ऑफ द कंपनी शुड परमिट द कंपनी टू इशू इक्विटी शेयर्स विद डिफरेंशियल वोटिंग राइट्स. So articles of association का authorization is required. If the articles of association they do not permit the company to issue equity shares with differential voting rights, तो उस situation में company DVRs issue नहीं कर पाएगी. So सबसे पहला condition which has to be complied with is AOA of the company should permit the company to issue equity shares with differential voting rights. The second important condition is that an ordinary resolution has to be passed in a general meeting. Ordinary resolution, special resolution is not required in case of DVR. It is an ordinary resolution which will be required in case of DVRs. Ordinary resolution ordinary resolution is basically do you know what is the difference between ordinary resolution and special resolution? DVR cannot be for more than one voting right. DVR में voting right कम ही होएगा, बढ़ेगा नहीं. Ordinary resolution is basically simple majority मिल गया, तो the company can go ahead and the decision is passed. However, special resolution की बात करते हैं तो वहाँ पे 75% का अप्रूवल मिलना चाहिए और उसके बाद ही स्पेशल रेजोल्यूशन पास होगा. सो DVRs इशू करने के लिए कंपनी को क्या लगेगा? ऑर्डिनरी रेजोल्यूशन लगेगा. However, if it is a listed company which is issuing equity shares with differential voting rights, so listed company को ordinary resolution पास करना पड़ेगा by postal ballot. Now, postal ballot का मतलब क्या होता है? Postal ballot is basically inviting votes of the shareholders, inviting votes of the members via post or any other electronic means. So if it is a listed company, they'll have to pass an ordinary resolution, but it has to be through a postal ballot. So first condition क्या है? Articles of association में लिखा होना चाहिए, authorize होना चाहिए. Second condition is ordinary resolution लगेगा. अभी third condition and a very important condition, and that is DVRs जब इशू कर रहे हो, DVRs का टोटल वोटिंग पावर जो है, it should not exceed 74% of the total voting power of the company. Say for example, there is a company जिसने 1 lakh shares issue किए. Now these are all equity shares, okay? 1 lakh equity shares are issued by a company, and out of 1 lakh equity shares, say 50,000 are with normal voting rights, and let's say 80,000 are with normal voting rights, and say 20,000 जो है वो differential voting rights के साथ है. So 1 lakh equity shares are already issued by the company. Now अभी यहाँ पे वोटिंग राइट कैसे काउंट करेंगे? DVR का से 1 शेयर इज इक्वल टू 1/10 वोट. सो टोटल वोटिंग पावर, इन ऑर्डर टू कैलकुलेट द टोटल वोटिंग पावर ऑफ द कंपनी, ये 80,000 का तो 80,000 रहेगा, बट ये 20,000 नहीं रहेगा. दिस विल बिकम 2,000 बिकॉज 1 शेयर इज इक्वल टू 1/10 वोट. So total voting power calculate करने के लिए you will have to calculate the share of DVRs or the voting rights of DVRs proportionately. Now say this company wants to make a further issue of equity shares with differential voting rights. So total voting power क्या हो गया इस company का? Say 82,000. ठीक है, total voting power is 82,000 currently. No, there is no separate authorized capital for DVRs. Authorized capital एक ही होगा. Authorized capital includes equity shares, preference shares, DVRs, सब कुछ included रहेगा उसमें. So total voting power company का हो गया say 82,000. अभी now this company wants to make a further issue of DVRs. Say 10,000 का DVR उनको और issue करना है. Now the question which comes now is, can the company issue, ये further issue company कर सकती है या नहीं कर सकती? अभी 10,000 DVRs इशू करेंगी तो कंपनी अगर इशू करेगी तो इसका वोटिंग राइट हो जाएगा 1,000. And the condition which has been specified, it says that the total voting power of DVRs, it should not be more than 74% of the total voting power. अभी ये 1,000 add करेंगे अगर DVR में, so it will definitely not go beyond 74% of the total voting power of the company. It is only 1,000 of DVR which is being issued. The total voting power is 82,000. So ये जो total voting power है, it includes DVRs का भी voting power. So जब DVR issue कर रही है company will have to make sure that the total voting power which the equity shareholders with differential voting rights have, it should not be more than 74% of the total voting power of the company. So आपको जो चीज यहाँ पे याद रखना है वो ये है, you will not get numericals like this, but कभी-कभी एग्जाम में या MCQ type question में they do give you some figures and you will have to then make some calculations and understand कि 74% से ज़्यादा है या नहीं. And questions on DVRs do come in examination. एक बार एक question आया था wherein they asked to state all the conditions which have to be complied with for a company to issue equity shares with differential voting rights, wherein you had to write all these points ki AOA ka authorization is required, ordinary resolution is required. So these are this is a very important topic altogether. Rule 4. It should not exceed 74%. Not exceeding is basically not more than. So if it is equal to, it is okay. So the conditions for issue of equity shares with differential voting rights, सबसे पहले authorization by articles of association, authorized by ordinary resolution passed at general meeting. अगर listed company है तो approved by postal ballot होना चाहिए. And the voting power of shares with differential rights shall not exceed 74% of the total voting power at any point of time. So voting power of DVR should not exceed 74% of the total voting power of the company. So basically, if we put it other way around, okay, let's not confuse you all. The voting power which shareholders with differential voting rights have, it should not exceed 74% of total voting power. और ये total voting power compute करने के लिए you are going to take voting power of equity shares with normal voting rights plus DVR. That will give you the total voting power of the company. And the next condition which has to be complied with is that the company has not defaulted in filing the financial statements and annual returns for the immediately preceding 3 financial years. Matlab, immediately preceding 3 financial years mein, the company should not have made any default in filing its financial statements and annual returns. So every company has to file its financial statements and annual returns every year. ये हर साल का requirement है. Financial statements are filed in form AOC 4 and annual return is filed in form MGT 7. So this you will learn of annual return and financial statement in section 92 and 134 respectively. So वहाँ पे आपको दिया गया है कि हर कंपनी को within 30 days of AGM अपने financial statements file करने with the registrar, and within 60 days of the AGM they have to file the annual return with the registrar. So if a company has made a default in filing annual returns and financial statements for the immediately preceding 3 financial year, तो फिर वो company equity shares with differential voting rights issue नहीं कर सकती. So in order to issue equity shares with differential voting rights, the company should not have made any default in filing the financial statements and annual returns for the immediately preceding 3 financial year. And apart from it, there are 2 more defaults which are being talked of. There, the company has no subsisting default. Subsisting matlab existing default. No subsisting default in payment of declared dividend to its shareholders. Say for example, company ने dividend declare कर दिया, but company ने shareholders को dividend pay ही नहीं किया. So उस situation में company has made a default in payment of dividend which has been declared by the company. तो उस सिचुएशन में कंपनी डीवीआर इशू नहीं कर सकती. या फिर से द कंपनी हैज मेड अ डिफॉल्ट इन रीपेइंग इट्स मैच्योर्ड डिपॉजिट्स. Deposits are nothing but amounts which are borrowed by the company. In simple terms अगर मैं बोलूँ तो amount raised by the company लोन के जैसा ही होता है. So जब मैच्योरिटी पीरियड आ जाता है डिपॉजिट का तो कंपनी को रीपे करना पड़ेगा. बट अगर मैच्योर होने के बाद भी कंपनी उस डिपॉजिट का रीपेमेंट नहीं कर रही है तो उस सिचुएशन में company has made a default and repayment of deposit. And since the company has made a default and repayment of deposit, company cannot issue equity shares with differential voting rights. And also if the company has made a default and redemption of its preference shares or debentures, so situation maybe company cannot issue equity shares with differential voting rights. So दो defaults देखें. पहला default was during the immediately 3 preceding financial year, the company should not have made a default in filing financial statements and annual returns. The second default, which we are talking of right now, which we spoke of right now, is basically there should not be any subsisting default. That is, there should not be any continuing or existing default with respect to payment of declared dividend or repayment of matured deposits or redemption of preference shares or debentures. अभी जो अगला default है वो ये बोलता है that in the preceding 5 financial year, company has not defaulted in payment of dividend on preference shares or repayment of any term loan to a public financial institution or dues with respect to statutory payment relating to employees. स्टैट्यूटरी पेमेंट एम्प्लॉयज के हो सकते हैं, ESI, EPF, ये सारे जो पेमेंट्स होते हैं एम्प्लॉय से रिलेटेड, उसका डिफॉल्ट नहीं करना चाहिए कंपनी ने. और क्रेडिटिंग द अमाउंट टू इन्वेस्टर एजुकेशन एंड प्रोटेक्शन fund. So in the preceding 5 years, the company should not have made any default of any of these kinds. So matlab kya? Say for example, a company has not paid dividend to preference shareholders in one financial year. एक financial year में, say for example in financial year 1920, the company fails to pay dividend to preference shareholders, has made a default and payment of dividend to the preference shareholders. And in the year 21-22, the company wants to issue equity shares with differential voting rights. You tell me, can the company issue equity shares with differential voting rights in this year 21-22, financial year 21-22 में क्या company equity shares with differential voting rights issue कर पाएगी? In 1920 they made a default in payment of dividend to preference shareholders. So 21-22 में they cannot do it. Why is that so? Because preceding 5 years में ये ऐसा default हुआ है. But say if I ask you, can the company issue equity shares with differential voting rights in the financial year 26-27? Will your answer change? Assuming all the other conditions are complied with. 26-27 में DVRs issue कर पाएगी company? Yes, 5 साल हो गए, which means in case any of these defaults have happened and 5 years have lapsed since that default, तो फिर company DVRs issue कर सकती है. However, 5 सालों में ही ये default हुआ है, तो फिर उस situation में company DVRs issue नहीं कर सकती. Clear है? Are you all clear with this much? Yes? Okay. So let's look at the other condition. The other condition is that the company has not been penalized by court or the tribunal during the last 3 years for any offense under RBI Act, SEBI Act, SECRA Act, FEMA Act, or any other special act under which the company is regulated. So last point क्या बोलता है? Last point ये बोलता है कि during the last 3 years, companies should not have been penalized by any court or by the tribunal under RBI Act, FEMA Act, SEBI Act or Securities Contract Regulation Act. In कोई भी act में company को कोई punishment नहीं होना चाहिए during the last 3 years. So if all these conditions are complied with, then only then the company can issue equity shares with differential voting rights. Now let's make it easier for you so that you remember all of these conditions. बहुत सारे conditions हो गए ना, 7 conditions है. So आप easily कैसे remember करोगे these 7 conditions? Let's make it very easy for you. So सबसे पहला वाला जो condition था for issue of DVR, सबसे पहले तो it is talked of in Rule 4. Rule 4 gives us the conditions which have to be complied with by the company whenever a company is issuing equity shares with differential voting rights. So सबसे पहला वाला, let's talk of 3 general conditions. There were 3 general conditions. What were those? First one was it should be authorized by articles of association. Second condition was ordinary resolution होना चाहिए in general meeting, and ordinary resolution by postal ballot in case of listed companies. Third one was total voting power should not exceed 74%, should not be more than 74%. So ये हो गए 3 general conditions. I hope there's no confusion in these 3 general conditions. Are these 3 conditions fine? ओके, सो ये 3 जनरल कंडीशंस थे. उसके बाद में हमने देखा 3 कंडीशन जो डिफॉल्ट से रिलेटेड थे. Now there were different types of default. एक था 3 years का default, एक था subsisting default, और लास्ट वाला था 5 years का. अभी 3 years का default जो था वो किससे related था? Financial statements and annual return. In the last 3 years, immediately 3 preceding financial years, the company should not have made any default in filing financial statements and annual return. So ये था first default. Second default था subsisting default. Subsisting default 3 चीजों के लिए था. कौन सी 3 चीजें थी? Can you tell me quickly? कौन सी चीजें थी? Dividend, then deposits, and redemption of preference shares and debentures. तो इसको आप कैसे याद रख सकते हो? इसको आप RDD करके याद रख सकते हो, subsisting default को. अभी now the last one was default in the preceding 5 financial years with respect to payment of dividend था, यहाँ पे भी declared dividend. फिर था statutory dues, और कौन सा था? Preference dividend, okay. And if 5 years have lapsed after payment of if the default has been made good and 5 years have lapsed, तो फिर उसके बाद the company can issue equity shares with differential voting rights, या फिर any other statutory dues with respect to employees, या फिर IEPF, that is Investors Education and Protection Fund से related कुछ भी default किया in payment. So 5 years, in the preceding 5 years, ये defaults अगर है तो company DVRs issue नहीं कर सकती. Which means these are 3 general conditions. These are 3 conditions which say that none of these defaults should exist, and only then the company can issue equity shares with differential voting rights. और last वाला क्या था? Last वाला was about not penalized by court or tribunal under any of the acts such as RBI, FEMA, SEBI, or any other act which governs company or securities contract regulation act. So इनमें से कोई भी act में the company shouldn't have been penalized in how many years? In preceding how many years? मेरे लिखने से 3 years. So ये सारी conditions है for a company to issue equity shares with DVRs. So if a company wants to issue equity shares with differential voting rights, ये सारी conditions जो है ये comply होने चाहिए. Now tell me, have you all understood all these conditions? Rule 4 समझ में आया सबको? और conditions याद हो गए सबको? I'm sure आप लोगों को अभी तक आधे conditions तो याद हो चुके होंगे. No, divide the conditions whenever you're studying. से बहुत बड़ा provision आ जाता है तो you should divide the provision and understand it. Group things related to same heading under one, and it will be easy for you to remember and recollect things during examination. So have you all understood rule 4? Yes, okay. अभी ये basic था. This is being given in rule 4 sub rule 1. Abhi, apart from it, there are some other requirements also which shall be complied with. Other requirements क्या है? ये basic requirements है. अभी जब भी कंपनी को वोटिंग करना होता है, रेजोल्यूशन पास करना होता है, कंपनी सेंड्स अ नोटिस टू इट्स मेंबर्स कि इस पर्टिकुलर टॉपिक पे वी हैव टू डिस्कस एंड वी हैव टू डिसाइड अपॉन दिस पर्टिकुलर टॉपिक. सो जब ये कंपनी नोटिस सेंड कर रही है, व्हेनेवर द कंपनी सेंडिंग अ नोटिस, if the notice is with respect to decision to be taken upon DVRs कि DVRs issue करना है नहीं करना है, तो उस situation में ये जो नोटिस है, this should there should be an explanatory statement attached with the notice which will state the details with respect to DVRs. मतलब कितने DVRs issue हो रहे हैं, what will be their differential voting rights, what is the excess dividend which will be paid to these equity shareholders with differential voting rights. So all these things shall be clearly stated in the notice, in the explanatory statement which will be attached to the notice which is sent for the purpose notice which is sent to the members. Also अगर एक बार DVRs issue हो गए, ठीक है, DVRs issue कर दिए कंपनी ने, ना कंपनी बोलती है ठीक है अभी डिफरेंशियल वोटिंग राइट्स के शेयर्स डिसकंटिन्यू कर देते हैं एंड लेट्स गो अहेड ओनली विद नॉर्मल शेयर्स. Is conversion of DVRs into normal equity shares possible? Do you think conversion of DVRs into normal equity shares is possible? क्या कंपनी DVRs को नॉर्मल इक्विटी शेयर्स में कन्वर्ट कर सकती है? आपको क्या लगता है? What do you think? Is it possible to convert DVRs into normal equity shares? We have understood, you might have studied ना, convertible preference shares होते हैं, convertible debentures होते हैं. So क्या DVRs भी convert किए जा सकते हैं? Can you convert DVRs as well? Do you think DVRs are convertible in nature? Give your opinion. Someone says proportional basis, someone says yes. Any other answer? दो ही लोगों ने आंसर किया है अभी तक. So the answer to this is no. Conversion of DVRs into equity shares is not allowed, and vice versa is also not allowed. Conversion of equity shares to DVRs is also not allowed. दोनों ही चीजें not allowed है. There is a restriction. There is a restriction which has been imposed by Rule 4 Sub-Rule 3, which clearly restricts conversion of equity shares with differential voting rights into equity shares with uniform voting rights, and vice versa is also restricted. मतलब इक्विटी शेयर्स को आप डीवीआरस में कन्वर्ट नहीं कर सकते हो और डीवीआरस को भी इक्विटी शेयर्स में कन्वर्ट नहीं कर सकते हो. So if someone asks you if is conversion of DVR into equity shares possible, the answer is no, and vice versa is also not possible. Equity shares को भी आप DVRs में convert नहीं कर सकते. You cannot do that. Now apart from it, board's report में disclosure होना चाहिए about issue of differential voting rights. Board's report एक report होता है जो बनाते हैं कंपनी वाले. So board's report should clearly disclose the details of issue of equity shares with differential voting rights, and वो सारा डिटेल जो होता है वो बोर्ड रिपोर्ट में स्टेट किया जाना होता है. अभी now I have one more question, and my question is, are equity shareholders with differential voting rights entitled to receive bonus shares? बोनस शेयर सिंपल टर्म्स में अगर मैं बोलूं तो फ्री का शेयर, आपको फ्री में मिल रहा है शेयर कंपनी का. सो नॉर्मल इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स को भी बोनस शेयर मिलता है. माय क्वेश्चन इज, आर इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स विद डिफरेंशियल वोटिंग राइट्स एंटाइटल्ड टू रिसीव बोनस शेयर्स? व्हाट डू यू थिंक? डीवीआर वालों को बोनस शेयर मिलना चाहिए? डू दे हैव अ राइट टू रिसीव बोनस शेयर? यस, नो, नॉट एप्लीकेबल? No idea. Okay, no problem. So I have all the three answers. कोई yes बोल रहा है, कोई no बोल रहा है. So the answer is yes. क्या है? DVRs, they do have the other rights similar as equity shareholders. है तो इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स ही ना. बोनस शेयर इशू हो रहा है तो बोनस शेयर का भी राइट उनके पास रहेगा. राइट शेयर इशू हो रहा है, उनके पास राइट शेयर मिलने का भी राइट रहेगा. सो ऑल द अदर राइट्स रिमेन सेम. इट्स जस्ट दैट देयर वोटिंग राइट इज डिफरेंट एंड their percentage of dividend would be different, but other rights, they will remain uniform. The other rights would remain same. So equity shares with differential voting rights, they do have a right to receive bonus shares whenever a bonus issue is made, and they also have a right to receive right shares. So these are some of the additional provisions with respect to equity shares with differential voting rights. So just quickly brush up, skim through all of this. So 4 sub rule 2 बोलता है explanatory statement to be attached to the notice, जहाँ पे भी डिस्कस होने वाला है अबाउट इन द मीटिंग और पोस्टल बैलेट का जब नोटिस दे रहे हैं मेंबर्स को. सो इट शुड कंटेन डिटेल्स की how many shares are being issued, what will be the issue size, what is the issue price, what are the rights which these shareholders are being given. So all of these details shall be clearly stated. Then for sub rule 3, it states that the company shall not convert its existing equity share capital with preference share cannot be converted into DVR equity with voting rights into equity share capital and carrying differential voting rights. So no, there are no different types of DVRs. DVRs एक ही टाइप का होता है. इक्विटी शेयर के 2 क्लासिफिकेशंस है, नॉर्मल वोटिंग राइट्स एंड DVRs. DVRs में अलग क्लासिफिकेशन नहीं है. There's no sub classification in DVRs. Rule 4, sub rule 4, it states that all these details shall be clearly stated in the board's report कि हमने equity shares with DVRs issue किए. So ये सारा detail board's report में होना चाहिए. The holders of equity shares with differential rights shall enjoy all other rights such as bonus shares, right shares, which normal equity shareholders are entitled to receive. And the register of members shall contain all the relevant particulars of the shares issued with differential voting rights. So, एक company register of members maintain करती है तो उसमें detail clearly देना चाहिए of equity shareholders who are having differential voting right. So, is this clear? Are you all clear with DVRs? Yes, explanatory statement will contain everything. It will contain why the company is issuing DVRs, what is the size, what is the number of shares which are being issued, what is the price which is being issued, unka differential right kya hoga, and also what is the additional percentage point of dividend which they will be paid. All the details will be clearly stated in the explanatory statement. Any other questions? Are you all clear with the differential voting rights? Are you all clear with equity shares with differential voting rights? Okay. So let's move ahead. I told you मैं आपको बताऊंगी section 44 और section 45 क्या बोलता है. Though not a part of your syllabus, but since you should have information about things. So section 44 basically says that the shares are movable and transferable in nature. Basically talks of जो shares issue होते हैं, shares जो होते हैं, they are movable in nature and they are transferable in nature. Transferable depending on the articles of the company, because private company के articles में clearly लिखा होता है that there is a restriction on transferability of shares. So the shares are definitely transferable in nature and movable in nature is what section 44 says. And section 45 जो है वो ये बोलता है that the shares of the company they shall be distinctively numbered. मतलब हर शेयर का एक यूनिक नंबर होना चाहिए is what section 45 talks of. So that is what section 44 and 45 talk of. ये पहले था आपके syllabus में, but अभी because the sections are not very relevant, they have removed it from your syllabus. 44 और 45 वो था. Now moving on to section 46. Now section 46 talks about share certificate. अभी शेयर सर्टिफिकेट क्या होता है, व्हाट इज अ शेयर सर्टिफिकेट. सो जैसे प्रूफ होना चाहिए दैट यू होल्ड शेयर्स इन दिस कंपनी. अभी क्या प्रूफ होगा आपके पास कि आप इस कंपनी में शेयर्स होल्ड करते हो, व्हाट इज द प्रूफ. तो शेयर सर्टिफिकेट इज बेसिकली एन एविडेंस दैट अ पर्टिकुलर पर्सन होल्ड्स सिक्योरिटीज और होल्ड्स शेयर्स इन दिस पर्टिकुलर कंपनी. तो एविडेंस होता है. अभी जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल आप लोगों के पास आपके 10th क्लास का सर्टिफिकेट होगा, पासिंग सर्टिफिकेट, यू हैव योर क्लास 12 पासिंग सर्टिफिकेट. वो क्या है, वो प्रूफ ही है ना कि आपने वो एग्जाम क्लियर किया है एंड यू स्कोर्ड सो एंड सो मार्क्स, यू गॉट सो एंड सो ग्रेड. और फॉर एग्जांपल बर्थ सर्टिफिकेट की बात करो तो बर्थ सर्टिफिकेट इज आल्सो प्रूफ बर्थ. So similarly, जब हम share certificate की बात कर रहे हैं, तो share certificate is again a proof that you hold share in that company. Abhi now, if I talk of present scenario, how relevant share certificate is in present scenario. You might have heard of something called as demat or dematerialization of shares. Ever heard of something like this? Yes. हाँ. So जब हम demat की बात कर रहे हैं, demat is basically digital version. It is not that you are getting physical shares. अभी ये जो share certificate का concept है, it was relevant जब shares का dematerialization नहीं हुआ. If you know what section 29 of the Companies Act says, section 29 बोलता है that every public company which is making an issue, every company which is making a public offer, their security should be in dematerialized form, and unlisted public companies bhi wahan pe covered hai. Not only listed companies but unlisted public companies are also covered there, section 29 mein. So in today's time or in present time, because of dematerialization of securities or dematerialization of securities, share certificate ka concept is not very relevant in today's time. रीजन बीइंग वेरी सिंपल, फिजिकल शेयर्स इशू होते थे तब वहां पे शेयर सर्टिफिकेट एविडेंस होता था कि हाँ आई होल्ड सो एंड सो शेयर्स ऑफ दिस पर्टिकुलर कंपनी. बट अभी जब डीमैट फॉर्म में शेयर्स इशू होते हैं नाउ बिकॉज ऑफ डीमटेरियलाइजेशन एंड डीमटेरियलाइजेशन ऑफ सिक्योरिटीज, you might have heard of CDSL and NSDL. सुना है CDSL and NSDL? Have you heard of depositories? Yes. So ये जो depositories है इनके पास there are several depository participants, and वो depository participants जो होते हैं उनके पास ये जो different clients होते हैं उनके accounts खुले होते हैं, and these are the accounts जहाँ पे demat accounts बोलते हैं. So you might have heard of names like Zerodha and Sher Khan जो trading platforms है. तो ये सारे these are example of depository participants. Okay, and NSDL and CDSL, they are the depositories. They are the two main depositories. So let me just give you some thoda basic information, and then we'll move with 46. ये जो है ये दो national depositories है जो शेयर्स का डीमटेरियलाइजेशन करती है, वो ये दो डिपॉजिटरीज है. अभी इन डिपॉजिटरीज के साथ बहुत सारे डिपॉजिटरी पार्टिसिपेंट्स रजिस्टर्ड होते हैं. Okay, so there are many depository participants who are registered with these depositories. Examples of depository participants would be Zerodha, शेर खान, ये जो भी ट्रेडिंग प्लेटफॉर्म्स होते हैं अलग अलग, they are a few examples of, yeah. So these are some of the depository participants. अभी ये depository participants के साथ क्या होता है, the clients they open their accounts with these depository participants and hold securities in dematerialized form. So हम demat account जो खोलते हैं वो इन depository participants के साथ होता है, and these depository participants they keep a track of the securities which every person holds. So after the depositories they started functioning in India, so listed companies के जो भी शेयर्स थे उनका डीमटेरियलाइजेशन मैंडेटरी हो गया. फिर उसके बाद सेक्शन 29 एंड रूल 9A has also made it mandatory for unlisted public companies to dematerialize their securities. So उस सिचुएशन में क्या हो गया, नाउ मोस्ट ऑफ द पब्लिक कंपनीज और लिस्टेड कंपनीज हो, पब्लिक कंपनीज हो या अनलिस्टेड पब्लिक कंपनीज हो, उनके शेयर्स जो है वो डीमटेरियलाइज्ड फॉर्म में ही है. So since their shares are in dematerialized form, they do not have to issue any share certificate. However, one company which is not covered here, or one company for whom dematerialization is not necessary, is a private company. अभी सेक्शन 29 जो है कंपनीज एक्ट का, उसमें प्राइवेट कंपनी का मेंशन कहीं पे भी नहीं. सो प्राइवेट कंपनी पब्लिक ऑफर मेक करती नहीं है, प्राइवेट कंपनी डज प्राइवेट प्लेसमेंट. So it is not necessary for a private company to get its securities dematerialized. And that's where the concept of share certificate becomes important, or that's where the concept of share certificate becomes relevant. So ये जो two depositories है, NSDL and CDSL, so उनके साथ there are several depository participants linked to them. The dematerialized securities, they are held by the investors in their demat accounts with these depository participants. और वो depository participants के साथ जो उनका demat account है, they keep a track of everything. They keep a track of the purchase made, the transfer made, transmission of shares. ये सारा जो है सब कुछ digitalized हो गया है, and everything is facilitated by these depository participants. So इस situation में क्या हो गया है? Now it is when we talk of the concept of share certificate, हम जब share certificate के concept की बात कर रहे हैं, तो it becomes relevant for a private company, because private company के लिए it is not mandatory to dematerialize its security. Listed company है तो dematerialization is mandatory. Unlisted public company के case में भी they have to dematerialize securities. Exceptions are there. If you remember section 29 and rule 9A जो हमने किया था, so वहाँ पे we've understood what are the different unlisted public companies who do not have to dematerialize their securities. say निधि companies, government companies जो है, इनको जरूरत नहीं होती अपने securities dematerialize करने की. So जब भी एक share है जो physical form में issue हो रहा है, whenever a share is being issued in a physical form, that's where dematerialization of securities becomes that's where issue of share certificate becomes important. अगर डीमैट फॉर्म है, डीमटेरियलाइज्ड फॉर्म है, तो वहां पे आपको शेयर सर्टिफिकेट नहीं मिलेगा. सो शेयर सर्टिफिकेट इज रेलेवेंट व्हेनेवर द शेयर्स आर इशूड इन अ फिजिकल फॉर्म. इज दिस क्लियर? इतना समझ में आया? ये डाउट आपको बाद में आता था, इसलिए आई क्लियर्ड इट पहले, एंड देन विल मूव ऑन टू शेयर सर्टिफिकेट से रिलेटेड प्रोविजंस. yes. Okay, so let's start with section 46. So section 46 ये बोलता है, ये whenever a company is issuing a share certificate, the share certificate of the company should be signed. अभी share certificate पे क्या लिखा होता है? Share certificate पे लिखा होता है the name of the holder of the share, how many shares does this person hold, details of the number of shares का distinctive number जो section 45 बात करता है, वो यहाँ पे share certificate में लिखा होता है कि हाँ ये share का ये number है. So जब भी physical form में shares issue हो रहा है, वहाँ पे share certificate becomes relevant. Now, whenever a company is issuing a share certificate, it has to be issued under the company's common seal. If a company has a common seal, the company has to affix its common seal on the share certificate. Now, is common seal optional or mandatory? Common seal optional है या mandatory है? Common seal was previously mandatory, now it is completely optional. Company may or may not have a common seal. Abhi it is optional. So a share certificate, it has to be issued under the common seal. If the company has common seal, the common seal ke under it has to be issued, or the company, it has to be signed by at least 2 directors of the company. And in case a company secretary has been appointed by the company, then 1 director and 1 company secretary. And the company secretary, they shall sign the share certificate of the company, and it will specify the shares which are held by any person. And share certificate will be a prima facie evidence of the title of that person on the share. Matlab, share certificate will be the first evidence, or rather, what do you understand by this term prima facie? I'm sure you would have come across this term prima facie at several places. Law में तो बहुत जगह use होता है. So prima facie का मतलब क्या होता है? Prima facie का मतलब क्या होता है? On the face of it, first impression. Correct. So share certificate is basically a prima facie evidence that the person who's holding the share certificate has the title to the shares which are mentioned in this share certificate. Abhi, what if a person loses his share certificate. शेयर सर्टिफिकेट गुम गया, से फॉर एग्जाम्पल बर्थ सर्टिफिकेट गुम जाता है तो क्या करते हैं? अगर किसी का बर्थ सर्टिफिकेट गुम गया तो क्या करेंगे? डुप्लीकेट. So similarly, company can also issue a duplicate share certificate. Now, कौन सी situation में will the company issue a duplicate certificate? अगर पुराना वाला शेयर सर्टिफिकेट है वो अगर गुम गया, मतलब if the share certificate has been lost, so उस situation में the company will issue a duplicate share certificate or it has been destroyed. और कुछ और हो गया with the share certificate, say it is torn or it is surrendered to the company. So in all these situations, the company issues a duplicate share certificate. अभी जब कंपनी डुप्लीकेट शेयर सर्टिफिकेट इशू करती है ना, कंपनी गेट्स एन इंडेमनिटी बॉन्ड साइंड. नाउ दिस इज ओनली अ पीस ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन फॉर यू. जब भी कंपनी डुप्लीकेट शेयर सर्टिफिकेट इशू करती है, कंपनी गेट्स एन इंडेमनिटी बॉन्ड साइंड. Indemnity, the term indemnity basically means protection. ठीक है. So whenever a company is issuing a duplicate share certificate, they get this indemnity bond signed, which states that अगर बाद में हमको पता चला कि आपने हमसे गलत चीज बता के या आपने हमारे साथ फ्रॉड किया है, so you will have to compensate us. Say for example, there's a person, Mr. Raj. भी राज कंपनी के पास जाता है और बोलता है कि Simran, she transferred her shares to me and I have lost the share certificate जो सिमरन ने मुझे दिया था. Now, transfer of share certificate वगैरह होता है, we'll talk about it under section 56. So अभी ये समझो कि सिमरन के पास shares थे. The actual shareholder of the company was सिमरन. Now there's a person, Mr. Raj, जो एक fraudster है. अभी राज कंपनी के पास जाता है और बोलता है कि प्लीज इशू डुप्लीकेट शेयर सर्टिफिकेट टू मी. सिमरन ने मुझे ट्रांसफर कर दिया था शेयर and now I've lost the share certificate, so you please issue a duplicate share certificate to me. Now company tries contacting Simran but होता नहीं है contact, और राज ना कुछ fake evidence दिखाता है कंपनी को कि नहीं ट्रांसफर हुआ है, and as a result of which say the company issues a duplicate share certificate to राज. अभी जब ये कंपनी डुप्लीकेट शेयर सर्टिफिकेट इशू करती है, कंपनी राज को बोलेगी रुको मिस्टर राज, यू हैव टू डू वन मोर थिंग, साइन एन indemnity bond with us. Raj asked, why do you want me to sign an indemnity bond? I am telling you that I am the actual shareholder now. कंपनी बोलती नहीं नहीं, आपको indemnity bond तो साइन करना ही पड़ेगा. Raj is okay. Now how will this indemnity bond protect the company? अब से मिस सिमरन ये गई कंपनी के पास and she now says to the company कि मेरा I want to sell my shares, मेरा शेयर सर्टिफिकेट गुम गया है, I want to sell my shares and I want to claim the money. मतलब कंपनी को शेयर वापस करके आप कंपनी मुझे वापस से मेरा पैसा दे दो. तो यहाँ पे तो कंपनी का लॉस हो जाएगा because company now thinks Raj is its shareholder. However, यहाँ पे the original shareholder, she goes to the company and she demands money for her shares from the company. So in this situation, abhi se agar company will have to give some money to Simran, so company can recover that money back from Raj. So ye indemnity bond will basically indemnify the company, will protect the company if any fraud is happening with the company whenever a company is issuing a duplicate share certificate. So this will become relevant when we go to the Contract Act. वहाँ पे we'll understand about contract of indemnity. So one of the contract of indemnity is when a company is issuing a duplicate share certificate and the person to whom the duplicate share certificate is issued, they sign an indemnity bond to indemnify the company in case there's any loss which happens to the company because of this particular person. So this was just a piece of information for you all कि जब भी शेयर सर्टिफिकेट डुप्लीकेट शेयर सर्टिफिकेट कंपनी इशू करती है तो एक इंडेमनिटी बॉन्ड भी साइन करवाती है. Was this clear? Okay, so let's now have a look at section 46. So section 46, it talks about the provisions with regard to share certificate, and it says it has to be issued under the common seal if the company has common seal, or signed by 2 directors or by a director and company secretary, specifying the shares held by the company. It is a prima facie evidence of the title of the person who is holding that certificate. Share certificate भी distinctively numbered होना चाहिए. Where shares are held in depository form. Depository मतलब demat form. The record of depository shall be prima facie evidence of the interest of beneficial owner. So this is where the shares are held in dematerialized form. तो depositories के पास जो भी record होता है of that shall be the evidence of ownership of any person. नाउ कौन सी केस में कंपनी डुप्लीकेट शेयर सर्टिफिकेट इशू करेगा? जब ओरिजिनल सर्टिफिकेट या तो गुम गया है या फिर डिस्ट्रॉय हो गया है या डैमेज हो गया है या फिर इट हैज बीन defaced, mutilated, torn or is surrendered to the company. मतलब all these situations are basically talking of डैमेज हो गया या फिर there's some से फट गया है या कुछ हो गया है, तो उस सिचुएशन में कंपनी डुप्लीकेट शेयर सर्टिफिकेट इशू कर देगी. Now if the a company issues a duplicate certificate, yes, you will get access to the notes. I'll let you know how you will get the access to the notes tomorrow. You will get the access to these notes. So the punishment for issuing duplicate share certificate with the intention to defraud. Agar a company with an intention to defraud डुप्लीकेट शेयर सर्टिफिकेट इशू करिए तो उस सिचुएशन में पनिशमेंट क्या होगा? कंपनी का होगा फाइन मिनिमम 5 times the face value of shares involved, maximum 10 times the face value of shares involved, or 10 crores, whichever is higher. So the maximum limit could be 10 times the face value of shares or 10 crores, whichever is higher. And जो भी officer in default होगा for this fraud will be liable for action under section 447. Do you all know what section 447 of the Companies Act talks about? Section 447 of the Companies Act, any idea what it talks about? Correct, it is punishment for fraud. And जहां पे भी Companies Act में आप ये देखोगे ना fraud word mention हो रहा है, वहां का punishment will be given under section 447 only. If you remember, आपने इनकॉर्पोरेशन का जब चैप्टर किया था वहां पे भी we come across कि अगर इनकॉर्पोरेशन डॉक्यूमेंट्स किसी ने fraudulently false information दिया है तो that person has to be punished under section 447. So anywhere in Companies Act, in the entire Companies Act, wherever you come across this word fraud which is being done by the officer of the company, that person will be punished under section 447. So 447 का punishment is punishment for fraud under Companies Act. Now talking of dematerialization shares, so listed company को तो electronic form में ही रखना पड़ेगा. Rule 9 ने unlisted companies को भी demat form में अपने securities list securities deal करने की बात करता है. So exceptions जैसे मैंने आपको बताया, निधि कंपनी, गवर्नमेंट कंपनी, wholly owned subsidiary company, these are some of the exempted unlisted public companies who do not have to hold their securities in demat form. But apart from this, सारी companies जो है, सारी unlisted public companies जो है, they shall hold their securities in demat form. So when we are talking of share certificate is relevant whenever shares are issued in physical form. So physical form में जब भी shares issue हो रहे हैं तब share certificate relevant हो जाएगा. Share certificate will be the evidence of title to the company. Now you tell me, is share certificate a document of title or document showing title? Is share certificate a document of title or a document showing title? I am sure document of title आपको पता है क्या होता है. Correct. So a share certificate is a document showing title, and it becomes relevant whenever the shares of the company are being issued in a physical form. Are you all clear with section 46? Any doubts, any confusions, any questions till now? Because इसके बाद जो section में start कर रही हूँ, section 47, it is very important and very relevant, wherein we'll talk of voting rights. डॉक्यूमेंट ऑफ टाइटल कुछ नहीं होगा शेयर्स का, डॉक्यूमेंट शोइंग टाइटल ही रहेगा. इट इज ओनली शोइंग द ओनरशिप. इट इज डॉक्यूमेंट ऑफ टाइटल क्या होता है? डॉक्यूमेंट ऑफ टाइटल बेसिकली सेल ऑफ गुड्स एक्ट याद करना पड़ेगा अगर आपको डॉक्यूमेंट ऑफ टाइटल एंड डॉक्यूमेंट शोइंग टाइटल का डिफरेंस. डॉक्यूमेंट शोइंग टाइटल ओनली शोज द ओनरशिप, डजंट गिव यू द मतलब वो डॉक्यूमेंट आप एंडोर्स करके ट्रांसफर नहीं कर सकते. हाउएवर से अगर आपके पास बिल ऑफ लीडिंग है या फिर से कोई और डॉक्यूमेंट है, बिल ऑफ एंट्री है, बिल ऑफ लीडिंग है, दीज आर इंपोर्ट से रिलेटेड डॉक्यूमेंट्स. ये डॉक्यूमेंट्स ना आप किसी और को ट्रांसफर कर सकते हो, एंडोर्स कर सकते हो इन फेवर ऑफ समवन एल्स. सो दैट्स अ डॉक्यूमेंट ऑफ टाइटल. मतलब अगर मैंने आपको डॉक्यूमेंट ऑफ टाइटल दिया तो अभी यू हैव द राइट, यू हैव द ओनरशिप राइट ऑन दैट पर्टिकुलर थिंग. वो जो डॉक्यूमेंट ऑफ टाइटल जिस भी चीज से रिलेटेड है, यू हैव दैट ओनरशिप राइट ऑन इट. हाउएवर जब मैं डॉक्यूमेंट शोइंग टाइटल की बात कर रही हूँ, अगर से मेरे पास शेयर सर्टिफिकेट है और मैं आपको शेयर सर्टिफिकेट दे रही हूँ, विल यू बिकम द ओनर ऑफ द शेयर्स? No, it is only showing that okay, this person is the owner. Yeah, common seal is optional. So common seal has been made optional, but share certificate has valuable information stating the number of shares you hold in the company, the value of the share. तो वो सारा So even if there's no common seal which the company has, company का share certificate will still be valuable. It is not necessary कि हर document पे common seal attached होना चाहिए और तभी वो document relevant होगा. So ownership, whenever we are talking of transfer of ownership, ownership का transfer मतलब basically giving the right in that property to that other person. So right transfer करने के लिए title is nothing but property in that property in the goods or ownership in the goods. So title आपको transfer करना पड़ेगा. Any other questions? Or can we move ahead with section 47? Okay. So section 47 talks about voting rights. कौन से शेयर होल्डर्स के पास वोटिंग राइट्स होता है? Which shareholders have voting rights? Equity shareholders, correct. So when we say equity shareholders के पास voting rights है, but let me tell you that there are certain situations wherein preference shareholders के पास भी voting right होता है. कुछ situations होते हैं जहाँ पे preference shareholders जो होते हैं ना, उनके पास भी voting right आता है. So when we talk of voting rights, अभी वोटिंग राइट्स किसके पास होते हैं? मेंबर्स, इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स के पास. कुछ वोटिंग राइट्स होते हैं जो सिर्फ इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स के पास होते हैं, कुछ वोटिंग राइट्स होते हैं जो सिर्फ प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स के पास होते हैं, और कुछ वोटिंग राइट्स होते हैं जो दोनों इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स और प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स दोनों के पास होते हैं. तो कौन सी वोटिंग राइट्स है और कौन सी वोटिंग राइट्स की हम बात कर रहे हैं, लेट्स अंडरस्टैंड. सो व्हेन वी टॉक ऑफ वोटिंग राइट्स, every member of a company which is limited by shares and who's holding equity share capital in the company, they have a right to vote on every resolution which is placed before the company. So in short, जब हम voting rights की बात कर रहे हैं, जब equity shareholders है company के, they have a right to vote on every resolution. Resolution basically means जो भी decision ले रहे हैं company में. So equity shareholders की जब हम बात कर रहे हैं, equity shareholders they have a right to vote on every resolution which is placed before the company. मतलब they are the ones who have the right to participate in the decision making in the company and they have a right to vote on every resolution. जो भी decision हो रहा है company में, equity shareholders के पास तो right रहेगा ही उस decision making process का part बनने का. So equity shareholders, they have a right to vote on every resolution which is being passed in the company, which is being taken by the company. However, when we talk of what is the right, मतलब voting right कैसे calculate करेंगे of equity shares, now there are different means of voting. Okay, when we go to the chapter of meetings, वहाँ पे हम समझेंगे कि different types of voting होती है in company. One such type is show of hands. Show of hands मतलब you just raise your hand and show whether you are in favor or whether you are against that particular decision. So show of hand में क्या होता है? Show of hand में तो you cannot count the number of shares. Show of hand में one person is equal to one vote. One member is equal to one vote. Show of hands में. The other means of voting is voting by poll. अभी poll में क्या होता है? Whenever voting by poll is happening, the vote is calculated in proportion to this person's share in the paid up capital. Basically, voting by poll की जब बात कर रहे हैं हम, तो वहाँ पे one share is equal to one vote हो जाता है. ठीक है? So when we talk of show of hands, it is one person is equal to one vote. Poll की जब हम बात कर रहे हैं, it is in proportion to your holding in the paid up share capital of the company, आपका vote count किया जाएगा whenever we are talking of voting by poll. So proportionate voting right होता है which the equity shareholders have. Now talking of the situation where the preference shareholders they get a voting right. So कहाँ पे मिलेगा preference shareholders को voting right? सबसे पहले तो अगर कोई एक डिसीजन ले रही है कंपनी विच इज डायरेक्टली अफेक्टिंग द राइट्स ऑफ द प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स, अगर कोई ऐसा डिसीजन हो रहा है कंपनी में, अगर कोई ऐसा डिसीजन लिया जा रहा है विच इज डायरेक्टली हैविंग एन इम्पैक्ट ऑन द राइट्स ऑफ द प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स, देन इन दैट सिचुएशन प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स को वोटिंग राइट मिलेगा. नाउ से फॉर एग्जांपल, आपके घर में आपके लिए आपके रिगार्डिंग कोई डिसीजन लिया जा रहा है, विल यू नॉट बी कंसल्टेड फॉर दैट डिसीजन? हमसे पूछ के किया जाए, हमसे बिना पूछे क्या हमारे लिए कोई डिसीजन लिया जाएगा? डेफिनेटली नॉट. अगर कोई यहाँ पे हाँ बोल रहा है तो फिर हाँ. सो सिमिलरली अगर प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स का कोई राइट इम्पैक्ट हो रहा है, there is some impact which a decision will have on the preference shareholders, तो उस situation में preference shareholders को भी right मिलेगा. They will also get the voting right. So when the first situation where the preference shareholders will get voting right is where there's something which is directly affecting their interest in the company or something which is directly having an impact on their rights. The second situation where the preference shareholders will get a right to vote is winding up of the company का जब resolution pass होता है तब वहाँ पे preference shareholders के पास भी voting right आ जाता है winding up of the company के केस में. या फिर any repayment और reduction का situation जो होता है in repayment of preference share capital या फिर reduction in the preference share capital. So उस situation में भी preference shareholders they'll get a right to vote. So these are the three situations, three specific situations wherein the preference shareholders will have a voting right. So first one is where there's something which is directly affecting their rights, so they'll get a right to vote. Winding up के resolution में, yes, they have a right to vote. If it is related to repayment or reduction in the preference share capital, then वहाँ पे preference share holders they'll get a right to vote. Now apart from this, एक situation है जहाँ पे ना preference shareholders will get a right to vote on every resolution. और वो कब आएगा? वो तब आएगा wherein dividend has not been paid to the preference shareholders for 2 years or more. अगर एक पर्टिकुलर क्लास के प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स को डिविडेंड नहीं पे किया गया for 2 years or more, then those preference shareholders they'll get a right to vote on every resolution which is placed before the company, on all the resolutions. So if dividend is not paid to preference shareholders for 2 years or more, then in that situation, that class of preference shareholders will get a right to vote on all the resolutions which are placed before the company. So सारे resolutions पे vote करने का right मिल जाएगा to the preference shareholders, whether it is an AGM, whether it is EGM, सब जगह उन लोगों को राइट करने का वोट करने का राइट मिल जाएगा. ये समझ में आया? Have you all understood the situations where the preference shareholders will get a right to vote? Okay. So let's now talk of एक बार इतना देख लेते हैं, उसके बाद में देखते हैं जब कोई एक ऐसा डिसीजन है जहां पे both equity shareholders and preference shareholders have a right to vote, how are we going to calculate the proportion of votes of equity shareholders and preference shareholders. So we'll do it with an example, एक example लेंगे. So let's have a look at the text of section 47 for this, and then we'll go to proportions. So section 47 talks about voting rights of members of the company. So equity shareholders है तो they have a right to vote on every resolution which is placed before the company. So basically जब भी company में first time voting होता है, it happens by show of hands. So one member is equal to one vote. वो वाला formula use किया जाता है. But however, if voting by poll is happening, तो poll के case में क्या होता है? Poll के case में proportion तो proportionately calculate किया जाता है the vote of every equity shareholders in proportion to what that shareholder holds in the paid up capital of the company. So that is the voting rights of equity shareholders of the company. Now talking of voting rights of preference shareholders. So preference shareholders कौन से resolutions पे vote करेंगे? 3 specific situations directly affecting the rights or winding up of the company after repayment or reduction of equity or preference share capital. इक्विटी कैपिटल रिड्यूस हो रहा है, रीपे हो रहा है, तब भी प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स के पास वोटिंग राइट रहेगी. प्रेफरेंस शेयर कैपिटल रिड्यूस या रीपे हो रहा है, तब भी प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स के पास वोटिंग राइट्स रहेगी. एंड हाउएवर इफ certain class of preference shares have not been paid for 2 years, dividend for 2 years or more, तो उस सिचुएशन में उनको राइट मिलेगा हर एक रेजोल्यूशन पे वोट करने का. They will get a right to vote on all the resolutions which are placed before the company in a situation where the dividend has not been paid to the preference shareholders for 2 years or more. तो उस सिचुएशन में उनको सारे ही रेजोल्यूशंस पे वोट करने का राइट मिल जाएगा. अभी लेट्स नाउ टॉक ऑफ how are we going to calculate the proportion of equity shareholders right and preference shareholders right जब दोनों का वोटिंग काउंट होगा. से फॉर एग्जांपल वाइंडिंग अप का रेजोल्यूशन पास करना. अब वाइंडिंग अप के रेजोल्यूशन में बोथ इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स एंड प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स विल हैव अ राइट टू वोट. बोथ ऑफ देम हैव अ राइट टू वोट व्हेनेवर वी आर टॉकिंग ऑफ वाइंडिंग अप. हमने देखा प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स में भी स्पेसिफिकली दिया हुआ है वाइंडिंग अप का रेजोल्यूशन है तो प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स आल्सो हैव अ राइट टू वोट. नाउ how are we going to calculate equity shareholders का proportion और preference shareholders का proportion? Now say for example total share capital of the company say 400 crores lakhs कुछ भी जोड़ लो. Let's say 400. Let's keep it easy for calculation. ठीक है? Say 400 rupees है total share capital. Hypothetical situation. This is only for making you understand. And out of this 400, 300 is equity share capital and 100 is preference share capital. ठीक है? 300 इक्विटी शेयर कैपिटल है और 100 जो है वो प्रेफरेंस शेयर कैपिटल है. तो इक्विटी शेयर इज टू प्रेफरेंस शेयर का रेशियो क्या हो गया यहाँ पे? व्हाट वुड बी द रेशियो ऑफ इक्विटी शेयर कैपिटल टू प्रेफरेंस शेयर कैपिटल हियर? 3:1, right? 3:1 is the ratio of equity share capital is to preference share capital. ये रेशियो आ गया हमारे पास. अभी यहाँ पे क्या होता है? नाउ से 80% prefer or let's say जो रेजोल्यूशन है इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स, अभी इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स फॉर भी वोट करेंगे, फेवर में भी वोट करेंगे, अगेंस्ट भी वोट करेंगे। प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स के केस में भी सेम हो सकता है। सो लेट्स से आउट ऑफ let's say 60% equity shareholders, they have voted in favor of this particular resolution, and 40% equity shareholders, they have voted against the resolution. अभी इसका proportion कैसे निकालेंगे? 60% ने favor में vote किया, तो 60 into 3/4. Why 3/4? Because the proportion of equity shareholders is to preference shareholders is 3:1. ये 3:1 आप लोगों ने यहाँ पे निकाला था प्रपोर्शन। सो यहाँ पे फेवर में काउंट करने के लिए हाउ मेनी पीपल आर इन फेवर, ये काउंट करने के लिए ये 3/4 करके हम प्रपोर्शनेटली डिसाइड करेंगे कि कितने लोग, कितना परसेंटेज फेवर में है। सो कितना परसेंटेज आएगा? 45। और यहाँ पे भी अगेंस्ट के लिए भी 40 into 3/4, सो यहाँ पे 30% आ जाएगा। Now let's talk of preference shareholders. Now let's say all the preference shareholders have voted in favor. सबने in favor vote किया. So say in favor vote किया तो 100% into 1/4, right? 100% into 1/4 आएगा. Why 1/4 here? Because preference shareholders, preference share capital का proportion is 1, right? ये समझ में आ रहा है? हाउ आर वी कैलकुलेटिंग दिस? तो ये आ गया 25% फेवर में। अभी टोटल फेवर में कितने वोट्स है? टोटल वोट्स इन फेवर 70% और अगेंस्ट कितने हैं? 30%, राइट? Is this calculation clear? Are you all understanding the calculation? How are we calculating these things? Yes. So फेवर में कितने लोगों ने वोट किया? 70% ने। अगेंस्ट कितने लोगों ने वोट किया? 30% ने। This is how we will calculate. This is how we are going to calculate the percentages, proportionate voting, wherein on one particular resolution both equity shareholders as well as preference shareholders are going to vote. So यहाँ पे do you think resolution pass होगा? The resolution will not be passed because winding up का resolution है, special resolution required है, फेवर में सिर्फ 70% है, तो रेजोल्यूशन विल नॉट बी पास। हाँ, इफ इट हैड बीन अ केस ऑफ ऑर्डिनरी रेजोल्यूशन तो रेजोल्यूशन पास हो जाता, बट सिंस इट इज अ रेजोल्यूशन फॉर वाइंडिंग अप, स्पेशल रेजोल्यूशन इज रिक्वायर्ड and the requisite votes in favor is only 70% here, required is 75%, तो यहाँ पे resolution pass नहीं होगा। Is this clear? Have you all understood this? How proportionate calculation is done, wherein on a resolution both equity shareholders as well as preference shareholders have a right to vote? समझ में आया सबको? And would you want to make a note of this? Vote by poll is simple. मतलब vote by poll, the resolution will not be passed because required 75% requirement is 75%. Had it been a case of ordinary resolution would have been passed. So basically क्या हो रहा है? In a situation wherein on a resolution both equity shareholders and preference shareholders have a right to vote, we'll first calculate equity shareholders का proportion to the preference share. We'll first calculate the proportion of equity share capital is to preference share capital. Proportion कैसे calculate करते हैं ये आप सबको आता है, right? So यहाँ पे ठीक है, I took basic figures so that ज़्यादा confusion ना हो. So since इक्विटी शेयर कैपिटल का फिगर था 300 रुपीज, प्रेफरेंस शेयर कैपिटल का था 100 रुपीज, वी गॉट द रेशियो ऑफ 3:1. अभी नाउ इसका मतलब ये है कि जब वी आर देन वी गेट द वोट्स, अभी फेवर में कितने वोट्स आए, अगेंस्ट में कितने वोट्स आए, वो भी हम प्रोपोर्शनेट कंप्यूट करेंगे टेकिंग दिस रेशियो ऑफ 3:1. सो equity shareholders, 60% equity shareholders, they have voted in favor. So उसका 3/4 computation we will take because it has to be in proportion to the equity shareholders holding and against 40% लोगों ने वोट किया तो 3/4 and preference shareholders का their portion is 1 when compared to equity shareholders, so इसलिए यहाँ पे 1/4 लेके proportionate computation किया and always be mindful of this. लास्ट में जो फेवर और अगेंस्ट का टोटल करोगे ना 100% ही आएगा. अगर 100% नहीं आ रहा है तो आपके कैलकुलेशन में मिस्टेक है. सो दिस इज ओनली फॉर योर बेसिक अंडरस्टैंडिंग कि whenever on a resolution both equity shareholders and preference shareholders are voting, तो उनका proportionate voting कैसे कैलकुलेट किया जाता है. These type of questions do not come in examination, but however this is very important for you to understand. कभी अगर आपको रेशियो निकालना रहा, ये रेशियो के बारे में डेफिनेटली आपसे एग्जाम में पूछा जा सकता है कि रेशियो कैसे निकालोगे. Is this clear now? Is the computation clear? Voting by poll is very simple. Voting by poll is basically one share is equal to one vote. That's what happens in voting by poll. Is this clear now, everyone? Do you want to make a note of this? Voting by poll is not same as show of hands. Show of hands is one member is equal to one vote. There's a lot of difference in voting by poll and show of hands. Say for example, I hold 10 shares in a company. If voting by show of hands is happening, my vote will be counted as only one. But if voting by poll is happening, my vote will be counted as 10 and not 1. Clear? Any other questions before we move ahead? So that's what this particular point talks of. अभी जो हमने discuss किया, the proportion of voting rights of equity shareholders to the voting rights of the preference shareholders shall be in same proportion as the paid up capital in respect of equity shares bears to the paid up capital in respect of preference shares. I did not read this particular point before because अगर मैं ये पहले पढ़ लेती तो आप लोगों को कुछ समझ में नहीं आता. But I believe that after doing that calculation, after doing that computation, this particular point is very clear. When we are calculating the proportion of voting rights of equity shareholders to preference shareholders, it will be in exact same proportion of how much paid up capital is held by the equity shareholders and the preference shareholders. Clear hai? Also, section 47 shall not apply to a private company where MOA or AOA of the private company so provides and which is not defaulted in filing its financial statements and annual return with registrar. इसका मतलब क्या है? इसका मतलब ये है कि प्राइवेट कंपनी अपने आर्टिकल्स ऑफ एसोसिएशन में वोटिंग राइट से रिलेटेड कुछ और प्रोविजंस भी बना सकती है. So a private company can be more innovative. They can with respect to voting rights. And उनके आर्टिकल्स में कुछ स्पेसिफिकली अलग स्टेट किया जा सकता है about the voting rights which the equity shareholders or the preference shareholders would have. So section 47 would not apply to a private company. However, a condition to be complied with is that the private company should not have made any default in filing of its financial statements or the annual return. तभी ये section उनको apply नहीं करेगा, नहीं तो otherwise ये section उनको apply करेगा. अभी तक जो भी डिस्कस किया, इज एवरीथिंग क्लियर? यस और नो? Okay, so we've covered section 43, section 46, section 47. अभी section 48 जो है it talks about variation in the rights of the shareholders. अभी variation in the rights of the shareholders मतलब क्या? Shareholder का जो right है, we are bringing some changes in the rights which the shareholders have. And there are different classes of shares which are issued by a company. जब हम class of shares की बात कर रहे हैं तो इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स का अलग क्लास होता है, प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स के अलग क्लासेस होते हैं, इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स विद डिफरेंशियल वोटिंग राइट्स, दे आर अ डिफरेंट क्लास. So there are different classes of shares which are issued by a company. And sometimes क्या होता है, कभी से कोई एक पर्टिकुलर क्लास के शेयर होल्डर्स के राइट्स चेंज करने हैं. अभी अगर शेयर होल्डर्स के राइट्स चेंज करने हैं तो आप जिनके राइट्स चेंज कर रहे हो, whomsoever's rights you are changing, you will have to obtain their consent. Whenever you are varying the rights of the shareholders, at that time consent would be required whenever any variation is being brought in. जब भी कोई चेंज कर रहे हो तो कंसेंट लेना पड़ेगा उन शेयर होल्डर्स से जिनके राइट्स आप चेंज कर रहे हो. So whenever any variation in the rights of the shareholders is happening, consent in writing has to be obtained. So consent in writing has to be obtained of not less than 3/4 of the members, or rather 3/4 of the shareholders of that particular class जिसका right आप change कर रहे हो. तो जिनका right आप change कर रहे हो उनके कम से कम 3/4 members का in writing आपको consent obtain करना पड़ेगा before varying their rights. So whenever we are talking of variation, अगर आपको कभी भी किसी के rights vary करना है तो आपको पहले उनका consent obtain करना पड़ेगा. You cannot just the company or the board of company cannot directly change or bring any variation in the rights of shareholders as and when they want to. If they want to bring any variation, they'll have to obtain consent, और वो consent भी in writing होना चाहिए. And not only in writing, that it has to be by holders of not less than 3/4 of the issued shares. 3/4 members का, कम से कम 3/4 members का आपको consent लेके आना पड़ेगा, या फिर by way of a special resolution which is passed at a separate meeting of this class of shareholders. अभी जब हम मीटिंग ऑफ कंपनीज की बात कर रहे हैं ना, देयर आर डिफरेंट मीटिंग्स व्हिच हैपन इन अ कंपनी, and one such meeting is a class meeting. Class meeting is basically of a particular class of shareholders, या फिर से creditors का meeting अलग से होता है, कभी debenture holders का meeting अलग से होता है. So class meeting is basically for a particular category of people, for a particular category of shareholders of the company, particular class of shareholders of the company. So अगर if a company wants to vary the voting right, या तो consent लेके आओ 3/4 members का, या in writing, या फिर एक special resolution pass करो in a separate meeting of that particular class of shareholders. So only then the variation would be allowed. So let's understand this with help of an example. Now say एक company है ABC Limited. Now this company has issued class A equity shares. These are equity shares with normal voting rights. Class B एक equity shares है with differential voting rights. फिर एक और preference shares का issue किया है इन्होंने. So different shares this company, class of shares this company has issued. अभी से company vary कर रही है rights of these preference shareholders. They are bringing some changes in the rights which these preference shareholders have. So इसके लिए क्या करना पड़ेगा? Preference shareholders at least 3/4 preference shareholders का consent obtain करना पड़ेगा. And this consent has to be in writing. जितना issue किया है, say for example, total issue जो किया है preference shareholders का, that is 4 lakh. और let's say ठीक है 4 lakh is the total preference share capital. और से 40,000 शेयर्स इशू किए कंपनी ने, प्रेफरेंस शेयर्स 40,000 इशू किए. सो इसमें से कम 3/4 का अप्रूवल लेना पड़ेगा इन राइटिंग. सो कम से कम 30,000 होल्डर्स का अप्रूवल लेना पड़ेगा इन राइटिंग. या फिर अगर ये कंसेंट इन राइटिंग आप नहीं लेके आ सकते हो सबका, तो डू वन थिंग, hold a separate meeting. Hold a separate meeting for this category of shareholders and pass a special resolution in that meeting. So उसमें भी 3/4 ही होता है, 75% is 3/4. So whether it is obtaining consent in writing or whether it is passing a special resolution, consent आप दोनों ही situations में 3/4 members का ले रहे हैं. Okay. So whenever a company wants to make any change in the rights of the shareholders, they'll have to obtain consent in writing of not less than 3/4 of the issued shares, or by way of passing a special resolution in a separate meeting of this category of this class of shareholders. And apart from this, अगर say for example ये preference shareholders का right change हो रहा है, but this is having an impact on the right of equity shareholders as well. In some way or the other, this is having an impact on the right of the equity shareholders as well. So if variation in rights of one class of shareholders is having an impact on another class of shareholders as well, तो उस situation में ये जो equity shareholders है ना, इनका भी consent obtain करना पड़ेगा और 3/4 लोगों का consent obtain करना पड़ेगा यहाँ पे भी. So whenever varying the rights of the shareholders, अगर it has an impact on some other category, some other class of shares, so we'll have to obtain their consent as well. इतना समझ में आया? We will go point wise. We are going slow. इतना समझ में आया? Yes. Okay. So let's have a look at the section and then फिर आगे के points discuss करते हैं. So where the share capital is divided into different classes of shares, variation in rights is not only variation in voting rights, it could be any other right of the shareholders as well. It is not only variation in the voting right of the shareholder. It could be any other right which is attached to the share. Say preference shareholders का dividend का rate change कर रहे हैं या फिर कुछ और change कर रहे हैं. So variation in rights could be anything, not only voting right. So whenever any variation is being made, so variation requires consent. Consent has to be in writing of how many? Of holders of not less than 3/4 of the issued shares of that class. So कम से कम 3/4 holders का consent in writing लेना पड़ेगा, और या फिर by means of special resolution passed at a separate meeting of the holders of shares of that class. And if variation is affecting rights of any other class of shareholders, so उनका भी 3/4 लोगों का consent आपको लेके आना पड़ेगा. So जिसका right affect हो रहा है उसका तो जिसका right vary कर रहे हो, जिसका right change कर रहे हो, उसका तो consent लेना ही पड़ेगा. पर अगर इसका right change करने की वजह से किसी और का right affect हो रहा है, it is having any effect on the right of any other shareholders as well, तो फिर उनका भी 3/4 लोगों का consent आपको obtain करना पड़ेगा. So the first point talks about consent. Consent has to be obtained. Then what are the conditions for variation in rights? So variation के जो provision है, they must be stated in the memorandum of association of the company or the articles of association of company. एंड अगर मेमोरांडम और आर्टिकल्स में वेरिएशन के कोई प्रोविजंस नहीं, मतलब आपकी कंपनी का मेमोरांडम या फिर आर्टिकल्स ऑफ एसोसिएशन, दे डू नॉट स्टेट एनीथिंग अबाउट वेरिएशन इन द राइट्स ऑफ शेयर होल्डर्स, so you cannot prohibit the variation. Variation should not be prohibited by terms of issue of that shares of the shares of that class. मतलब just because it is not being stated in the MOA or AOA doesn't mean that you will restrict or you will prohibit any variation of that particular class of shares. So variation तब भी allowed रहेगा, हाँ आपको special resolution pass करना पड़ेगा. What if people do not give their consent for variation? Consent is essential for variation. Consent नहीं मिलेगा तो variation नहीं होगा. अभी क्या होता है ना, इसमें अगर मिनिमम लोग हैं, वो लोग अगर उनको कंसेंट नहीं देना है तो वो लोग ना ट्रिब्यूनल को अप्रोच कर सकते हैं. दे कैन अप्रोच द ट्रिब्यूनल and get this variation cancelled. But उसके लिए at least 10% holders, they'll have to approach the tribunal. So in our example, वो जो 40,000 शेयर्स थे उसमें कि होल्डर्स ऑफ एटलीस्ट 10% शेयर्स दे विल हैव टू अप्रोच द ट्रिब्यूनल अगर उनको ये वेरिएशन जो है वो कैंसिल करवाना. So an application can be made to the tribunal to get this variation cancelled, but उसके लिए the application has to be made by not less than 10% holders of the issued shares of that class. So कम से कम 10% holders को वो application make करना पड़ेगा to the tribunal. So the where holders of not less than 10% of the issued class of shares do not give their consent to the variation, they can apply to the tribunal. So minimum कितना requirement है? अगर minimum dissenting shareholder should be 10%. So at least 10% shareholders अगर consent नहीं दे रहे, they are not in favor of the variation, they can apply to the tribunal to get this variation cancelled. And this application shall be made within 21 days after the date on which the consent was given or resolution was passed. मतलब say 10% were not in favor, say 11% were not in favor, but बाकी के जो 89% लोग हैं उन्होंने अपना consent दे दिया. अभी उन्होंने अपना कंसेंट दे दिया तो 3/4 लोगों का कंसेंट तो आ गया. अभी 3/4 लोगों का कंसेंट आ गया तो ये जिस डेट पे कंसेंट आया उस डेट से विद इन 21 डेज ये जो 11% लोग हैं या 10% लोग हैं ये लोग ट्रिब्यूनल को एप्लीकेशन कर सकते हैं. सो देयर इज अ टाइम लिमिट फॉर मेकिंग एन एप्लीकेशन विद द ट्रिब्यूनल. इट हैज टू बी मेड विद इन 21 डेज फ्रॉम द डेट on which the resolution is passed or within 21 days from the date on which the consent has been obtained. And the application may be made on behalf of all shareholders who are entitled to make application by any one or more of them in writing. So सारे लोग मिलके भी application कर सकते हैं. कोई एक one representative को appoint कर लेंगे और that one person can make an application on behalf of all the shareholders who are involved. And where such application has been made, variation shall not have effect until it is confirmed by tribunal. और एक बार अगर ऐसा application चला जाता है tribunal के पास, variation will not be effective unless and until tribunal उसको confirmation देता है अपना. So tribunal का confirmation obtain होने के बाद ही the variation will become effective. And जो भी decision होगा tribunal का, whether the tribunal says the variation is fine, whether the tribunal says no, the variation has to be cancelled. कैंसिल क्यों हो रहा है? क्योंकि 10% एटलीस्ट 10% लोग ट्रिब्यूनल को अप्लाई कर रहे हैं एंड कैंसिल नहीं होगा इमीडिएटली. ट्रिब्यूनल को अप्लाई करेंगे देन ट्रिब्यूनल विल डिसाइड व्हाट टू डू, वेदर कैंसिलेशन शुड बी डन और कैंसिलेशन शुड नॉट बी डन. This is basically a right which is given to the members who are not giving their consent for the variation. ठीक है?
Yes, ma'am.
So whatever is the decision of the tribunal अगर बोलता है variation is fine and the company should go ahead with variation, it shall be binding on all. If the tribunal says no, the variation shall be cancelled, that decision shall also be binding on every member of the company. So whatever is the decision of the tribunal, that will be the final decision and that will be the binding decision. वो decision सब पे binding होगा, company पे भी binding होगा और इन members पे भी binding होगा. And ट्रिब्यूनल जब अपना डिसीजन देगा, ट्रिब्यूनल एक ऑर्डर पास करता है. सो विद इन 30 days ऑफ द ऑर्डर ऑफ द ट्रिब्यूनल, द कंपनी विल हैव टू फाइल अ कॉपी ऑफ दैट ऑर्डर विद द रजिस्ट्रार ऑफ कंपनी कि हमको ऐसा ऐसा ऑर्डर मिला है ट्रिब्यूनल से. सो जब भी कंपनी को कुछ भी ऑर्डर मिलता है फ्रॉम द ट्रिब्यूनल और फ्रॉम एनी अदर प्लेस कंपनी इज रिसीविंग एनी कम्युनिकेशन, द कंपनी हैज टू मेक श्योर कि वो सब हर एक इंफॉर्मेशन जो है वो अपने रजिस्ट्रार्स को प्रोवाइड कर रही है. So this is what section 48 talks of. So it basically talks of variation and rights. Variation करने के लिए आपको consent लेना पड़ेगा. Consent is essential if you want to vary the rights of the shareholders. Consent या तो two forms में हो सकता है, या तो special resolution pass करो in a separate meeting या फिर 3/4 holders का consent लो. And if it has an impact on any other class of shareholders, तो उनके भी 3/4 holders का consent has to be obtained. And whenever obtaining consent, the consent has to be in writing. Consent हमेशा writing में होना चाहिए. And उसके अलावा it has to be as prescribed by MOA, AOA और MOA आपका जो भी prescribe करता है इसके बारे में, the variation has to be in that manner. Also, if there are some shareholders who have not given their consent, so and if it is there are at least 10% shareholders जिन्होंने consent नहीं दिया है, तो ये 10% shareholders मिलके ट्रिब्यूनल को एप्लीकेशन कर सकते हैं टू गेट द वेरिएशन कैंसिल्ड. एंड से अगर सिर्फ 8% शेयर होल्डर्स है who have not given their consent, can they make an application to the tribunal? Can they make an application to the tribunal to get the variation cancelled? Only 8% people can, 8% holders? No, they cannot. So not less than 10%, matlab at least 10% log hone chahiye whenever making an application to the tribunal for the purpose of cancellation of the variation. And within how many days the application has to be made by these people? Within 21 days from the date of obtaining consent or from the date of special resolution. Within 21 days, this application has to be made to the tribunal. And tribunal ka jo bhi, this application can be made either by all of them together or any one of them on behalf of all of, who is acting on behalf of all, and he can make an application to the tribunal. And whatever is the decision of the tribunal will be binding on everyone, binding on the company, binding on the shareholders. जो भी tribunal का decision होगा वो final decision होगा. And tribunal का order आने के 30 days में this copy of this order has to be filed with the registrar of companies by the company. So this is what section 48 talks about. Are you all clear with section 48? Are you all clear with section 48? समझ में आया section 48? Any doubt, any questions? So we'll not move ahead. अभी आज यहीं पे we'll stop. Tomorrow we'll start with 49, and tomorrow is going to be a very important and a very interesting class. Reason being, we are going to understand about issue of shares at premium, discount, and sweat equity shares as well. So कोई question है? You all can ask your questions. We are here for 5 more minutes. So if you have any questions, you can ask your questions here. My name is Ashlesha. I hope you all understood whatever we've discussed today. Any doubts? WhatsApp पे नहीं. You can approach us on forums. We'll be happy to help. आप forum पे अपना doubt post कर सकते हो. Any other questions? Forums, if you have downloaded our app OneFin, उस पे एक forums का section होता है wherein you can post your doubts and queries. Okay, just and also since you all have joined after we finished 3 chapters already, we have a backup of the previous 3 chapters as well. So if you wish to register for the classes even now, it is completely fine. The class timings daily are from 2 to 4:30. So yeah, you can join the classes now as well. We have the backup available and you all can see those classes as well. So do not be scared या worried कि पुराने chapters का क्या होगा. आपको backup मिल जाएगा of all the previous chapters which we've done. And this is going to be a Hindi plus English live batch. So English और Hindi दोनों में class होगा. You can also inform your friends about the chapter which we are doing right now, and if they wish to join in, they can also join in. Meanwhile, if you have any other questions, do let me know. We are here for 2 more minutes and then we shall leave. how long we expecting to complete this by mid-September. So it's been already 10 days since we started. And we expect to complete it by second week of September. Yes, the free session will cover only chapter 4 in detail. And this is for both students appearing for November 22 as well as May 23. You will get access to the material as well. Let you know about that. Okay, then it was good interacting with all of you. Join tomorrow sharp 2 o'clock. We'll start with section 49. And in case you have any doubts, happy to help all of you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.